So, been a while, hasn't it? I guess I should probably explain what the hell this is. So, back in early 2022, I want to say around February, maybe March, early March, I decided I wanted to make a video essay inspired by, likes of Sarah Z and Folding Ideas and, that kind of people. And I decided I wanted to do it on the phenomenon of Sans Undertale. Because, that's a pretty interesting topic. I'm sure other people have done it before, but, I wanted to go in depth on it and, honestly, go off the rails. Eventually it would turn into this sort of spiraling sort of diatribe about Undertale and Deltarune and what they mean and all that. I wrote a script for it. I wrote a full script that was so long. It was over 10,000 words, definitely. And so I was like, okay, I've written the script. I have ideas for the video. I have enough equipment to record it. So I'm just gonna do that. I'm gonna make this a video essay. And so I recorded it. And I started to edit it. And when I put it in Premiere, things started going wrong. And I eventually realized that I was trying something different at the time with recording longer videos because, my PC is decently big, but always running out of storage because I put everything on it. And so I would save the video to a flash drive first. And so that way, if I wanted to, transfer it, it was easier. And if I wanted to keep it on here, I could just transfer what files I needed to. And it worked. But not for long. I want to say my first recording, the first, 15 to 30 minutes or so were basically flawless. Well, not flawless. There were stutters and hiccups in the visuals, but the audio was perfectly fine. And then after that point, it was just completely corrupted. Nothing salvageable. Would break Adobe Premiere when I put it in and moused over it. It was just broken. And so it was like, okay, so I'm going to have to reshoot this entire thing, which was over 2.5 hours. And I did that. And I did it in 3 recordings that were all at the same time. Well, not same time, but sequential. And I recorded it, and I started editing it again. And I realized that all of my passion for the project, all of my excitement, and all of my energy for completing it had completely died. I mean, to put it into perspective, the raw footage was, let me pull it up here. Yeah. The first part was, let me see here, 1 hour and 7 minutes. Second part was 1 hour and 13 minutes. Well, hour 14, but rounding. And third was 23 minutes. So, well over 2.5 hours of raw footage. And I would have to compress that into what would probably be about 2 hours, maybe 1 hour 45. And that would include footage from the game, the live footage of myself, and the footage of just... I would have images from across the internet, and of, archive. It would even included voicing, or voice acting, of various parts from the game, based around, Sans, tutorial, and all that stuff. And I think my edit that I was able to actually get done was the first 10, maybe 15 minutes. Not nothing, but still, like, a lot of ways to go. And the hyperfixation had completely died, and all of my energy was just gone. So that's why I didn't upload much late March and most of April. And the reason I'm putting it out now, in the state that I'm about to, is my plan is that I'm not going to be in this apartment anymore. That's why I'm sitting like this. Well, no, I'm sitting like this because I didn't plan properly, but yeah. My plan is to move out of this apartment this summer. And there is no way that I'm going to have this edited by summer. Especially because starting like May 31st, like, I am doing classes again. I'm going back to school. Well, not going back to doing online classes, but you know what I mean. So, by the time I would be able to edit and put all of the project together, I would no longer be in this apartment. If this were, like, because I usually do, like, voiceover stuff and not, like, face cam, that would mostly be fine. Except the problem is that I'm doing music videos now, which I mostly shoot in my apartment. So if I upload anything like that, it's gonna be like, oh, here's this nice new apartment, and then suddenly 2-hour-long video of this. And so what I've decided to do is shoot this weird intro thing, edit it down a little bit, and then show you the raw footage. That's why this video is so goddamn long. Because this is all of the live action, I guess, footage that I shot for the Sans project. It's going to be titled Sans Undertale, a video essay, you know, very blah. But I cannot edit it the way I want it to. And I've considered hiring an editor, but, like, I can't even monetize my videos, so, like, how do I pay them? Like, I could pay them, but, like, it would have to be, like, a fixed rate, and, like, I would much rather just handle my editing for myself. But, yeah. This is the Sans Project, a failed video essay. So, I don't have, like, a So, I don't have, like, a mug or wine glass or even really a cup to complete the standard. I'm not good at this. Okay. So, I don't have, like, mug or wine glass or even really a cup to complete the standard video essay as sitting down to talk to you look. I just never got any breakable drinking stuff for my apartment. But I do have, let's talk about Sans Undertale. This is water, by the way. In September 2015, a game made by Toby Fox, also known online as Radiation, was released for PC and Mac, titled Undertale, a couple years after a successful Kickstarter campaign. It wasn't necessarily the first game project Fox released, as he had done some ROM hacks of the SNES game Earthbound in the past, including the somewhat infamous Halloween hack. I'm gonna start that whole sentence over. It wasn't necessarily the first game project Fox released, as he had done some ROM hacks of the SNES game Earthbound in the past, including the somewhat infamous Halloween hack, but he was mostly known as a composer, having created a lot of music in the past, most notably creating or repurposing tracks for the webcomic Homestuck, both for use in the comic itself and as semi-official, semi-fan albums. Undertale was his first full retail release game, and saying it was successful is an understatement. The game was a huge hit, quickly being regarded as one of, if not the best game of the year, and becoming something of an indie darling. In Undertale, the player controls a young human who has fallen into a mountain and found the kingdom of monsters living in the underground, and who journeys through the underground, meeting the various monsters and solving various puzzles in order to reach the only known exit to the kingdom, and presumably return home. The game received positive remarks for pretty much every aspect, from its mix of turn-based and bullet-hell gameplay, inventive character design, amazing music, genuinely both emotional and hilarious writing, to its interesting meta-narrative regarding the nature of choice and freedom within video games and, by extension, the real world. Pretty much the only aspect that received significant criticism in professional circles was the game's graphics and graphical style, though this aspect has also received a fair amount of praise, as it does fit with the game's themes and ideas. Public perception of the game was, and arguably still is, extremely positive as well, though the game did suffer some inevitable hype backlash, especially with many fans saying it was the best game ever made, which, I don't know, that's never going to be a fully objective statement about any game, right? Basically, these days, most people who know a significant amount about Undertale know it one of three ways. The first is as a brilliant, if somewhat low-budget masterpiece created mainly as a passion project by one man with the help of his artist friend, the incredible Timmy Chang. The second is, somewhat in response to the former, a much more negative view, with many seeing the game as, at best, an okay game that experienced an unfounded and absurd amount of popularity, and, at worst, a terrible game whose fans are almost all, if not completely, driven by undeserved hype. I mostly fall in the former category, of course. And then the third group knows that it's the game the weird bone man from Tumblr came from. Okay, so rewinding a bit, let's talk about where this all started. The characters of Sans Papyrus were used heavily in the game's marketing. Okay, so rewinding a bit, let's talk about where this all started. The characters of Sans and Papyrus were used heavily in the game's early marketing, particularly the game's Kickstarter campaign, presumably because they are two of the best characters to show off the game's sense of humor. While the characters technically didn't appear in the game's demo, at least how they would in the finished game, they did make a... While the characters technically didn't appear in the game's demo, at least how they would in the finished game, they did make a cameo appearance at the very end, referencing their lack of presence. They were also the primary features of the Kickstarter's tier explaining video. This should give you a good idea of how important these two were to the game, even while it was still in development. Sans, also known as Sans the Skeleton, is the first character the player encounters after leaving the ruins, aka the tutorial area of the game, aka the area shown in the game's demo. He's introduced pretty ominously, but he's pretty quickly revealed to be just a fairly chill, funny dude who takes an interest in the main character due to him technically being employed to hunt humans down. Well, at least that's how it all seemed at first. While Sans' presence is most felt in the second main area of the game, Snowdon, which he patrols along with his... While Sans' presence is mostly felt in the second main area of the game, Snowdon, which he patrols along with Papyrus, his brother, the two are arguably the most recurring characters in the game. For Papyrus, this is both because of his connection to the head of the Royal Guard, Undyne, who is the central figure for the next area of the game, Waterfall, and because a fairly easy-to-access event allows the player to get Papyrus' number at the end of his area, allowing them to call him at almost any time. These phone calls can also involve Sans, especially if the player doesn't do a somewhat more difficult-to-access event later on, but Papyrus is the primary character accessed through these phone calls. Sans, however, is arguably an even more prevalent character. He appears pretty regularly throughout the game's He appears pretty regularly throughout the game's next two main areas, Waterfall and Hotland, often for short jokes at the player's expense, or just to continue the running gag that he has several different jobs, all for the sake of having several different mandatory breaks. And at least on an average playthrough, that's where Sans' importance seems to stay for the majority of the game. Then he says he'd have killed you hours ago if it weren't for a promise he made to your mother figure. Yeah, in the back half of the standard playthrough, it suddenly becomes clear that there's a lot more going on with Sans than initially appeared. Not only did he spare the main character seemingly exclusively because he promised Toriel, the character the player met early on, that he would protect said main character, but he also has a decided dark side. Things get even more mysterious in the game's final area, New Home, where Sans appears as a judge. It's kind of difficult to say what exactly is supposed to be going on in-universe, especially with just how meta this moment really is. See, one of Undertale's central mechanics is the ability to either spare or kill pretty much any monster the player encounters. Throughout the game, this has small and big consequences. For example, if you kill Papyrus, then all those encounters with Sans I mentioned, yeah, those disappear. Likewise, if you kill Undyne after befriending Papyrus, he won't answer your phone calls anymore and will spend the rest of the game outside her house. However, aside from a few mentions by Undyne and the game's antagonist Flowey, the player isn't really given the impression that killing smaller or less important monsters is that big of a deal. However, here near the end of the game, Sans tells the main character that, in reality, every murder they've committed has been hidden in plain sight. Like the EXP you've been earning, those aren't abstract experience points. They're an in-universe calculation of how much you've killed and how willing you are to commit acts of violence. They're execution points. That's a line that, depending on who you ask, is either really cool or really cringy. Fuck you, Cringe is dead. Now, why exactly Sans is the one telling us this, or how exactly he knows any of this, is ambiguous. However, if you hear his speech through once, then reload the save immediately before the speech and talk to him again, he'll give you a more in-depth analysis of your total EXP and level of violence. Unless you've killed Papyrus, then he's a bit more understandably hostile towards you. Nonetheless, this indicates that in some way, shape, or form, Sans is able to judge the exact statistics of what the player character has done. That got a lot of interest, especially from players who were analyzing the meta-narrative of the game, which we will get into more a bit later. However, it's not the neutral run that got the most attention on Sans. While Undertale has a ton of different routes you can take, depending on what happens and who dies, there are generally three main run categories. The neutral run encompasses the vast majority of routes, and unless the player instinctively grinds up EXP until they literally can't anymore, this is almost certainly the first run they'll complete. It takes the player through the Ruins, Snowdin, Waterfall, Hotland, the Core, and finally New Home, ending in the two fur bosses against Asgore, King of the Underground, and Flowey, or Omega Flowey, or Photoshop Flowey, or whatever you want to call that monstrosity. Finally, after the final boss is defeated, the player character leaves the Underground, and Sans calls them sometime in the future to tell them what exactly happened after they left. Again, somehow Sans learns the player character's phone number, even if Papyrus and Tutorial are... Again, somehow Sans learns the player character's phone number, even if Papyrus and Toriel are dead, and the only other character who interacts with their phone, Alphys, is missing, which is definitely suspicious. There's also the pacifist route, or true pacifist route, which many consider the game's true ending and is definitely the happiest one. Sans does feature in this ending, but most of the stuff in the ending is stuff we're gonna have to save for later, since the plot involved is kind of world-shaking. All you need to know is it's very meta, very emotional, and almost everyone lives happily ever after, and the player character's name is Frisk. Additionally, while you can meet most of the requirements for this ending on your first playthrough, certain events specifically related to Undyne and Alphys won't trigger unless the player has already defeated Flowey's final boss at least once, for reasons that I could theorize about, but I want to keep this video under 2 hours, so I need to rein in some of my rants. Finally, there is the genocide route, or the no mercy route, or the bad times route, or the route that shall not be named, or whatever it's hip to call the run where you kill literally everyone in the Underground. Again, we'll get into the greater details of this run later on, but the big point for the discussion is the final boss. The neutral route had Asgore transitioning to Flowey, and the pacifist route had a resurrected version of the character Flowey used to be. We'll get there, I promise. But the no mercy route has Sans. In the area where he would normally judge the player, he instead challenges them to a battle. This battle is memorable. It's one of, if not the hardest boss fight in the game, despite Stan's stat being mathematically garbage. He has 1 defense, and going through the game's files, 1 hit point. He has 1 attack, and his attacks can only do 1 damage. However, 2 things make it an actual nightmare, even compared to the other super hard boss fight in the game. However, 2 things make it an actual nightmare, even compared to the other super hard boss fight in the run against Undyne. Number 1, while his attacks technically only do 1 damage, they don't activate invulnerability frames. So for every single frame his attacks overlap with the soul, the player takes damage. Keep in mind the game runs at 30 FPS, so even if it only hits the soul for a second, it'll still do 30 damage. Number 2, he's the only monster in the game that can dodge your attacks, and he dodges all of them. Yeah, 1 hit from any weapon will kill him, but good luck hitting him. All that combined with the most difficult attack pattern seen in the game, which are also constantly changing in rules and strategy, and yeah, this is a pretty difficult fight. On top of all that, throughout the fight, Sans talks about how his reports, or in his words, our reports, which raises even more questions, indicated the changing of timelines, as well as the approaching end of everything. This is a reference to the player and player character being able to reload saves and change what they do, as well as the character of Flowey being able to do the same. Apparently, this knowledge has caused Sans to fall into what is, if not a name, at least in spirit, an extreme depression, often refusing to do anything useful because even if he tries, it could all be reset in an instant, and he may not even remember it. This insight into the character, both answering and raising questions, made him even more popular than he was when people were just treating him as a comic relief skeleton. It was all crazy. So, confession, I wasn't really one of the dedicated Sans fans, at least not of the kind a lot of people probably think of. Like, yeah, the first ever fanfic I published did have Sans as the main character, but okay. If we're going to say there was a dedicated Sans fandom, especially... like, yeah, the first ever fanfic I published did have Sans as the main character, but... okay. If we're going to say there was a dedicated Sans fandom, separate from the... like, yeah, the first ever fanfic I published did have Sans as the main character, but... okay. If we're going to say there was a dedicated Sans fandom, separate from the Undertale fandom, we have to address that the Undertale fandom also had its own opinions on Sans, and there was crossover between the two. And look, let me explain. There has been a long, extensive history of the quote-unquote Tumblr sexy man. The term isn't completely accurate, as the trend does extend outside of Tumblr and arguably predates it. You could argue DeviantArt is where the phenomena was truly born, but realistically, it's probably existed in smaller ways over decades and has just been given the room to grow in the modern internet. A TSM, for those unaware, is a trend where fans of a work, especially female queer or queer female fans, latch onto a single character, usually a man, and, well, sexualize the fuck out of them, seemingly illogically. The most infamous example, of course, is the Onceler from the 2012 Illuminations adaptation of the Lorax, a character whose popularity was so bizarre and exclusive, the most common trend for his fandom was to ship him with other versions of himself. Beyond the Onceler, notable characters include Wheatley from Portal 2, Bill Cipher from Gravity Falls, and Tony the Talking Clock from Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared. There are other more debatable examples, either due to having smaller fan bases or because there's more of an argument to be made that they are actually attractive. Professor Hitchens from Star Kids and the guy who didn't like musicals, various characters from the mobile game Cookie Run, Jack Skellington from The Nightmare Before Christmas, Connor from Detroit Become Human, pretty much any character from Five Nights at Freddy's, including the literal child murderer, and even King Candy from Wreck-It Ralph, have all been ascribed the Tumblr sexy man label at one point or another. You might have noticed there really isn't any hard and fast rule about what qualifies a character for the title. In general, though, there are some disqualifiers people have picked up on, ranging from the obvious and acceptable of not children to the more problematic, pretty much never a person of color. Like, even when a character is at most barely anthropomorphic, they tend to be given human versions that are, well, decidedly pale. These humanizations also tend to be extremely skinny twinks as well, though this at least doesn't seem to be a requirement for a more humanoid character to be a TSM. Also, whether or not real human beings such as Benedict Cumberbatch or Misha Collins can count as Tumblr sexy men is kind of up in the air, but we can at least rule out the majority of the British royal family. Gonna try that one again, just get a second take on it. Also, whether or not real human beings such as Benedict Cumberbatch or Misha Collins can count as Tumblr sexy men is generally kind of up in the air, though we can at least rule out the majority of the British royal family. Alrighty then. So, the trend of characters developing their own dedicated fandoms who find them irresistible for some reason long predates Sans. However, he was arguably one of the most popular examples, possibly even second only to the aforementioned Onceler. Now, again, I wasn't part of this fandom, though one girl I went to group therapy with and still follow on Tumblr definitely was. Now, again, I wasn't part of this fandom, though one girl I went to group therapy with and still follow on Tumblr definitely was. I have seen a lot of content from the fandom still, and in general, it was interesting. So, okay, why are there so many comparisons to the Onceler? Like, even more than the average Tumblr sexy man? Well, the main reason is the AUs and alternate versions. Now, unlike the Onceler, this wasn't inspired by any split of the existing characters' actions. There weren't two entirely separate comic relief pun-loving Sans and existentially horrified and brutally depressed Sans being shipped. Or, in general, outside of the different Flanderizations different areas of the fandom gave him. Instead... this will probably go with game footage. Instead, it seems the comment about timelines jumping around inspired creators to begin crossing over various AUs that existed. And probably worth discussing some of those AUs. Okay. And it's probably worth discussing some of those AUs. One of the most popular Undertale AUs that became extremely connected to the Sans Undertale phenomenon was Underfell. The basic idea of the AU was, what if Undertale, but the monsters were actually evil and violent instead of the teddy bears most of them are in the actual game? Exactly how far this idea went varied between works, of course. Some had most of the characters being fundamentally the same as the game, but with more of a societal pressure to hate humans and be monstrous, while others had monsters straight up feed off humans. Like zombies or vampires. That last one should probably explain why this took off in terms of people viewing it as sexy. The AU also paid specific attention to how Sans and Papyrus were reinterpreted. Papyrus was generally made the captain of the Royal Guard and much more antagonistic towards Sans, who by extension was generally a lot more aggressive towards the human or humans passing through. Again, definitely a lot of bad boy, sexy monster interplay going on, with this version of Sans even having specific nicknames for the human, and I'll shelve the discussion of that for later. Personally, I've always felt like the Underfell AU was kind of weak in terms of characterizing the other monsters. Like, sometimes they'd have more interesting interpretations, like Metaton, the glitzy reality show robot, being interpreted as an actual killing machine that still chases ratings. But, like, here's a question. Why is Papyrus in such a position of power instead of, say, Undyne? Like, if the whole Underground is that much more aggressive and violent, surely the character who was already aggressive and violent would just thrive all the more. Again, these things vary between works, so it's possible some fics answer this, or even fully avoid the issue through fanon. Still, I can see why it appealed to some more hardcore fans. Another extremely popular AU, and one that had a bit more thought put into the other characters, was Underswap. The general premise behind Underswap was switching characters' personalities or roles in the stories and seeing what comes out. I say a bit more because, well, a lot of role reversal fanfics in Undertale, or really any fandom, can run into the problem of just supplanting one character on top of another and saying you made a third. So some works in Underswap would switch Alphys and Undyne, but in reality would basically just make a version of Undyne that looked a lot more like Alphys, and vice versa. This applied to the skeletons as well, with Sans and Papyrus switching pretty much every character trait, and a lot of their new ones not really coming from every... This applied to the skeletons as well, with Sans and Papyrus switching pretty much every character trait, and a lot of their new ones not really coming from either source. Like this version of Papyrus tends to smoke, which doesn't really come from Papyrus or Sans, honestly. Again, this isn't really a universal problem, as the universe does have variants, and both the original idea for the AU and a lot of fan interpretations do give characters greater depth and nuance than just Toriel, but acting and thinking exactly like Asgore. Of course, it should be noted that the AU's original creator essentially abandoned the work and left the fandom completely, mainly because fans just couldn't behave themselves. Like, fully deleted their Tumblr. It was that bad. Including font cess, which I'll talk about, don't worry. Or actually, do worry. A lot. But briefly ignoring that unpleasantness, there were a lot of other AUs, as well as specific reinterpretations of Sans exclusively, sometimes with one or two other characters ported over as well. Interpretations of Sans included Error Sans, a version of Sans who had been horrifically mutated by an error in the game, Fresh Sans, a 90s theme incarnation ostensibly based on a minor character from the Gravity Falls series finale that is actually an Eldritch Abomination, and Pirate Sans, a version of Sans from a universe in which Monster Society was stranded at sea and took to pirate ships, except not because they just made all that up and found a pig with a suitably pirate-looking Sans. The trend was common enough that eventually people began writing works in which various interpretations of the character met, usually through time-space shenanigans. And, you know, sometimes they kissed each other. And did more. Self-cess, as is generally referred to in fandom spaces, is surprisingly common. Like, common enough, there is a generally agreed-upon universal term, common. While the Onceler is the most infamous example, and Sans is generally close behind, it pops up in a lot of different fandoms. In particular, the Homestuck fandom has multiple works based around it, partially because time travel and cloning are extremely major plot devices in the comic, and partially because different versions of characters, be it through alternate timelines or full alternate universe, pop up frequently enough that I'm pretty sure there has been at least one reference made in the comic itself to the idea that these alternate selves making out. The concept can be uncomfortable for some people, especially since the sus... The concept can be uncomfortable for some people, especially since the "cess" suffix in the name is so prominent. I promise we'll get to it. But a lot of fans just don't really have any issue with it. I mean, the question of whether or not you would fuck your clone is a... the question of whether or not you would fuck your clone is A, common enough, people just ask and answer it online regularly, and B, completely fantastical and absurd. Like, I guess it can be uncomfortable to be connected to, say, certain emotions people have about twins, but in general, most people don't have a literal separate version of themselves that they can or can't make out with. So trying to litigate whether that's moral or not is kind of pointless. So, yeah, a lot of people drew or wrote about Sans literally fucking himself. This led to even further questions and skepticism from outside observers. In particular, the fact that the character in question was, well, a skeleton. I mean, sure, it's not a particularly realistic skeleton, but he is canonically made of bones, which led to many questioning how exactly he could, get it on. I'm gonna have to explain the whole Ecto-weiner thing, aren't I? So I'm not going to show any clips or pictures during this section because as much as I'm okay with other people not monetizing the video, I prefer it not get completely nuked from YouTube for violating TOS. Cool, cool. So they gave the skeletons magical penises. Basically, the idea is, although the characters don't seem to have certain anatomical features in-game, including tongues, eyes, and yes, genitals, they can still create facsimiles using magic. This sort of has support in-game. Like, Sans and Papyrus canonically don't have eyeballs, but Sans does have eyelights in his skull that he has the ability to sort of turn on and off, and which flicker blue and orange at certain times during his fight. Well, one of them flickers blue and orange, but, you know. So the general idea is, in addition to these fake pupils, Sans and possibly Papyrus can magically replicate other organs on or inside their body. And because some magic in the game is color-coded, and Sans is generally associated with the color blue, many fans decided that when Sans has organs, they're also a blue color. This includes his tongue, as shown in fan art where he opens his mouth, and, well, his penis. I don't want to linger on this longer than I have to. You can kind of understand both why this was seen as necessary and why it was seen as fucking ridiculous. Some creators did use the opportunity to get even weirder and kinkier, of course, but Some creators did use the opportunity to get even weirder and kinkier, of course. I'm pretty sure there was art where he had a tentacle down there, but in general, they just kept it to replicating human anatomy. It's weird, but it's hardly the weirdest thing to ever be included in fan work. I mean, personally, I tend to believe that slight body modification and matter creation through magic is possible among monsters. I mean, we kind of see as much during the fight with Snaps to Blue, but while some magic can be colored, it doesn't necessarily have to be, as most magical attacks in the game do appear to be white, which would also blend in pretty well with Sans and Papyrus, as they are skeletons who are canonically a white color themselves. But there is also the question of whether the magic creations would actually function as proper organs, or if they would essentially be inanimate objects, and if it's the latter, I guess they could still use it in that context. What would it basically just be a somewhat more elaborate dildo, but there's also the question of whether or not other people can interact with the object without being hurt, since we never actually see a monster touch another monster's magic in game, and most of the magical creations Frisk can touch do seem to hurt them, but that might be applying too much literalism to the game mechanics, even for this game, especially since battle sprites for various monsters are all white despite them ostensibly being more multicolored. But then again, the colored attacks and heart colors are specifically referenced in-game, indicating there is some level of verisimilitude involved, which also raises the question of, if the Phantom penises are that cyan blue, does that mean that people can only feel them if they constantly move around, or maybe staying still is the only way to feel that kind of organ without it hurting you? Although I guess technically the former is more in keeping with Sans' personality, as logically you would prefer to stay still while the other person does all the moving. But then again, based on Toby's statements, Sans may be canonically asexual, so trying to bring his canon personality into the conversation may be missing the mark completely. And either way, it's like, for the record, my brain just kind of does that for most topics. I guess while I'm talking about uncomfortable and sexual aspects of all this, we should probably discuss the incest thing, plus the, God fucking damn. I guess while I'm talking about uncomfortable and sexual aspects of all this, we should probably discuss the incest thing, plus the, child porn stuff. And there are people in the apartment above me, and God, I hope they don't call the cops on me for discussing this gross-ass shit. So, while shipping Sans with himself was common, and shipping him with Papyrus was common, another common ship was with the game's player character, Frisk. Now, technically in the game we never see any confirmation of how old Frisk is, but it is at the very least heavily implied that they are in fact a child. Probably somewhere between 7 and 12. This is implied by Toriel, who has experience with humans, referring to and treating them as a child, and by Sans referring to them in dialogue as Kid. This nickname of Kid tends to be kept in a fair amount of fan work. Yeah, it'd kind of be disingenuous to act like the fandom was just people having fun and like there weren't deeply concerning parts of it. Well, I'm not condoning this in any way. I will say it's not necessarily intended for pedophiles. Like, yes, some works which include the character in a sexual context were definitely aiming for that niche. and the fandom in general kind of has issues with the whole age thing. But I don't think you can definitively state every fan who was interested in the ship was 100% a pedophile. Like, for starters, a lot of fiction art did age Frisk up to make them explicitly an adult. And while this isn't necessarily good, and can sometimes be used to justify more than anything else, it is at least better than the alternative. Plus, there is the fact that a lot of writers just used Frisk as a reader-slash-writer insert. Like, at least a lot of the time, the intention isn't for the young character to be attractive, but for young fans to find Sans attractive and project onto the younger character. As for Fontcest, a lot of works involve Sans and Papyrus being shipped together, which is honestly less gross than the minor shit. It's definitely still very uncomfortable, at least for a lot of people, but it is just kind of a thing people did. To be fair, they did often try to mitigate it in one way or another, and when they didn't, at least acknowledge how weird it was. Like, while there were probably a lot of people who were genuinely into incest, I don't think that's the exclusive reason so many people ship the skinny twink and the stout bear. Also, their skeleton's made of dust, so they can't really be blood-related. I hate myself. I could do a whole rant about my views on incest and underage stuff in fan works, but like, this is still supposed to be a video about the funny bone guy from a game I love, and this just makes me feel physically ill. So, okay, I think we can all agree this is all pretty weird, right? Like, even ignoring the disturbing rabbit hole we just passed, this kind of obsession with the character was decidedly abnormal, at least enough to gain outside interest. A lot of it was your pretty standard gawking, you know, the teenage girls are obsessed with what? You know, the kind of responses that are why any critique of Twilight has to include the analyzer stating they aren't just making it to shit on the concept of girls liking things. Popped my jaw there. However, as you could probably tell, there was also a lot of confusion and dislike from more reasonable angles. The comparisons to the Onceler fandom weren't common and well-deserved. However, I feel like while this was the closest any character has gotten to that level since, it is still a very different situation. Mainly because, like, most people don't really like the 2012 Lorax movie at all. Like, the Lorax was a poor adaptation of a work that missed several points of the original and was just kind of boring and annoying, with maybe a few good songs and decentish animation. Meanwhile, Undertale's, like, one of the most influential indie games ever. Also, like, Sans popularity didn't just come from Tumblr users like Skinny White Guy like the Onceler. Well, just looking at the general list of TSMs, I'd actually say Sans is kind of an outlier, since he is explicitly short and seemingly overweight. Now, a lot of works do remove the former, making him significantly taller than most humans, and some fan art does downplay his weight, but a good majority does keep his larger build, which honestly is kinda nice. But my point is, the interest in Sans wasn't born just because a lot of people found him attractive. Like, the section on just what Sans is like in the game and conclusions drawn... Like, the section on just what Sans is like in the game and conclusions drawn from that was about 1,600 words. And I didn't even get into every possible angle of analysis there. This is a character people first became interested in because he was a well-written, nuanced, important character in a narrative they enjoyed. Like, I don't think we're really being fair when we compare a character this complex and nuanced within their own text with a character whose motivations and actives... Like, I don't think we're really being fair when we compare a character this complex and nuanced within their own text with a character whose motivations and actions are so disconnected, people genuinely invented a literal split personality to explain how he became cartoonishly evil over one admittedly alright song. Also, completely unrelated side note, How Bad Can I Be is fine, but I would love to live in the reality where the song Big Ring made it into the movie and just see what the hell kind of movie that would be. Like, I'm imagining some kind of dystopian rock opera, and it's a lot cooler than just the 2008 Horton Hears a Who movie, but pro-free. Finally, without wishing to steal even more from Sarah Z than I already have, one of the main reasons of Finally, without wishing to steal even more from Sarah Z than I already have, one of the main reasons the Onceler fandom emerged so wholeheartedly is because there really wasn't anywhere else in the work worth shipping him with.
Like, even ignoring the fact that the other three main characters were two literal children and a furry marmot the Onceler pseudo killed, there really wasn't anything all that interesting people had to say about the other characters. And, like, people had a lot to say about the other characters on Undertale. We've already mentioned two already, Frisk and Papyrus, who break the Onceler mold just by being shipped with Sans, because apparently the fandom doesn't have the Onceler's Phantom's aversion to incest and underage shipping. Still, even outside of that very fucking unsettling framework, both characters received a lot of analysis and love from fans. Still, even outside of that very fucking unsettling framework, both characters received a lot of analysis and love from fans. Now, obviously, not every character got this level of attention, and I'd argue if any major characters were on the losing side of the conversation around Sans, it was probably Alphys and Undyne. Now, there is a long discussion that could be had about these two, about their roles in the game, how Undyne is enjoyable and important to the story, but overall not really a featured player in the overarching plot, how the general response to Alphys has something to say about fandom's refusal to engage with morally complex and troubling characters, how weird it is that two of the biggest characters to get neglected are the two characters that are canonically queer and end the game in a WLW relationship. But, like, I'm already expecting this video to reach up to the hour mark, so I'll just point out how absurd it is that on the biggest fan... But, like, I'm already expecting this video to reach up to the hour mark, so I'll just point out how absurd it is that on the biggest fanfic site online, the tag for the canonical endgame relationship between two main characters has over 1,000 less fics than the tag for Sans literally being in a relationship with himself. I just find that ironic. But it's not all bad. While Alphys has had a lot less discussion and fanworks than I'd say she deserves. But it's not all bad. While Alphys has had a lot less discussion and fanworks than I'd say she deserves, her creation Metaton has gotten a lot of fan love for his complex backstory and relationships, his themes of transness and general queer aura, and just being charismatic as all hell. Like, look at those legs and tell me you wouldn't fucking... People love a lot of characters from Undertale, and while, yes, the fandom for Sans in particular is vast and outshines a lot of characters, it's worth noting that even if you look for fics on AO3 without Sans at all, there are still over 12,000. More than all 1,539 fics in the Animal Crossing fandom, all 330 Crash Bandicoot fics, all 2,154 more than all 1,539 fics in the Animal Crossing fandom, all 330 Crash Bandicoot fics, all 2,154 Doki Doki Literature Club fics, all 3,458 Half-Life fics, including any and all Half-Life VRAI fics, and all 2,818 fics based on the Sonic video games, all combined, and over 20 times the number of fics about the game Celeste, which is an amazing game with an excellent story that for some reason only had 58 fics at the time of writing, and for the self-set shippers who love Sans, there's already an in-universe other self for the game's main character, plus a lot of interesting points to be made about mental health, trauma, and queer identities. The point is, well, one, please go write fics and draw fan art for Celeste, but two, the Undertale fandom wasn't just Sans and maybe occasionally shipping someone else with it. There was a lot to this fandom. Especially for the furries. Doing here 40 minutes. So we've kind of been avoiding a lot of Undertale's larger plot, and that's because admittedly a lot of the Sans-specific fandom tends to be very separated from that plot. Like, to the point where a webcomic was created that was completely separate from Undertale, but still uses a lot of characters invented for the fan. However, it is worth talking about the main plot, mainly because, like, the main Undertale fandom is fully capable of obsessing over and flanderizing characters that aren't skeletons named after fonts. So, the Dreamer family. The first two characters the player meets in Undertale are a sentient flower named Flowey that we'll do a deep dive later on. The first two characters the player meets in the first two characters the player meets in Undertale are a sentient flower named Flowey, that we'll do a deep dive on later in this section, and a goat-like monster by the name of Toriel. Toriel is the player's guide through most of the ruins, especially the tutorial areas. Oh, I just got that. Nice. Toriel is framed very interestingly. Early on, she's framed as a pretty harmless, even helpful figure, maybe a little overbearing and overprotective, but still caring, nurturing, and, well, motherly. Like, there's a reason so many fans refer to her as Goat Mom. She holds Frisk's hand, she makes them pie, she even offers them cinnamon and butterscotch for their first day underground instead of snails. The word there is first, not snails. Yeah, once the player finally arrives at Toriel's house, things take a more sinister vibe. It becomes clear quickly that her intention is for Frisk to stay with her in the ruins basically forever. Also, she has a box full of children's shoes and toys and art seemingly made by other kids, and I'm pretty sure this is the exact plot of a Grimm fairy tale. Naturally, once the player starts asking her about the possibility of leaving, she tries to dodge the question and avoid the topic, and once that proves ineffective, she goes to seal the exit to the ruins permanently, essentially trapping Frisk with her forever. Except, it quickly becomes clear it isn't that straightforward. It turns out, Toriel has seen multiple human children fall into the underground and, after leaving the ruins, be killed by the monsters who inhabit the rest of the kingdom. And she's not wrong. While we see bits and pieces of these children as early as the ruins themselves, they are scattered all across the kingdom, and it is made explicitly clear that the King of the Underground has, either through his own actions or those of his people, taken 6 human souls through the deaths of what is generally implied to be children. Also, we eventually learned that a critical part of her backstory is the decline and death of her first adopted child and the subsequent brutal murder of her only biological son. Through this lens, it's kind of obvious why she isn't too keen on Frisk leaving her behind to go journey through a kingdom that 100% intends to kill them and take their soul. Also, and this might just be an issue of story and gameplay segregation, but like, she never actually destroys the exit to the ruins. You could take real-world days to even challenge her and she won't do anything. So yeah, probably not an evil witch straight out of Hansel and Gretel. Now, you may have noticed mentions of the King of the Underground, as well as a character named Asgore. As you might guess, these two are the same character, King Asgore Dreamer, and if that name already sounds kind of scary, just keep in mind that Dreamer is spelled as an anagram of murderer. Asgore has been the ruler of the Underground for a long time, possibly for as long as there even has been an Underground. At first, he's characterized a bit inconsistently. That mention from Toriel is his first mention and frames him like a terrifying, almost certainly bloodthirsty monster, both in species and in spirit. His mech mention by Papyrus instead seems to indicate he's mostly seen as a pushover and friendly guy, with no real goals beyond the protection of his people. In fact, it's fairly easy on a first playthrough for players to not realize that the two characters being mentioned are one and the same, at least until near the end of Waterfall, where Undyne refers to him as King Asgore Dreamer. Undyne in particular discusses this odd duality, recounting how, when she first became a part of the Royal Guard, Asgore was very kind, thoughtful, and caring, while also being Undyne in particular discusses this odd duality, recounting how, when she first became a part of the Royal Guard, Asgore was very kind, thoughtful, and caring, while also being almost impossible for her to initially defeat and very clearly dangerous. Of course, this duality is ultimately present in most characters on Undertale. Most monsters you encounter in the Underground are fun, quirky people with fairly complex personalities who nonetheless are 100% willing and able to kill a literal child, and figuring out why and how that is forms a large part of the game's plot. See, as you might have figured out from the discussion of family in this section, Asgore and Toriel aren't complete strangers. They were, in fact, the married rulers of the Underground, members of the same powerful subspecies known as boss monsters, and mutual parents to 2 children, their biological son Asriel and their adopted human child, who we'll get to in a second. As previously mentioned, both children died, their adopted child seemingly through freak disease and accident, and Asriel through being killed by humans while attempting to return his sibling's body to the village they were initially born in. While Toriel reacted to this with pure grief and sorrow, Asgore, as king of the monster, then having just lost both his children within less than 24 hours, declares war on humanity and vows that any human who falls into the underground from that point on will be killed. It's made pretty clear that he comes to regret this vow, as he really doesn't actually like hurting or killing anyone, but it's also one of the only things providing people the underground with any hope, as the power of 7 human souls is needed to destroy the barrier that keeps the monsters trapped underground. So, essentially, through a combination of grief and his duty to his people, Asgore is forced to continue his declaration of war, and by the time the game begins, he has either directly killed 6 previous humans, or at the very least, allowed his people to kill those humans and then taken the souls. Again, he really doesn't want to do this, and it's made clear that while he does try to be a good ruler, and he may have occasional moments of actual happiness, he's also a deeply hurt and tragic figure who feels immense guilt for all the death he is responsible for. This shines through at the end of a standard playthrough, when the player finally meets Asgore in person, and he's just kind of a nice but sad dude. He's initially very pleasant, simply watering flowers and offering to help with whatever's going on, until he turns around and sees the human child who has made it all the way to his castle. He tries to exchange some pleasantries with Frisk, but by this point it's clear that's... there's not much that either of them can do. He is bound by his duty to kill Frisk and save his people, and not long before this, the player learns that the only way for a human to leave the underground is to claim a monster's soul, and unfortunately, the only monsters whose soul can be taken when they die are boss monsters like Asgore. He calmly leads Frisk to the barrier, giving them a chance to complete any unfinished business they may have in the underground, and then the battle begins. And he destroys your ability to spare. The whole fight is brutal and heartbreaking. It's clear that Asgore doesn't want to do this, and depending on how the player has gone through the game, they probably don't either. Also, it's not an easy fight. It's nowhere near as difficult as the brutal fights on the No Mercy route, and it's actually a bit easier than the true final boss against Flowey shortly after, but it's still a very tricky fight to get around, especially if you've been playing the game pure pacifist up to this point. Especially because this is more or less the one fight where sparing just isn't an option, and it's actually pretty easy to have reached this point in the game without ever actually engaging with the game's attacking mechanics. Regardless, the fight can still be beat, and the player learns the sheer depths of his grief and guilt. It's really emotional. Both Toriel and Asgore have received a lot of love and analysis from the fandom, and it's easy to see why. They are core characters, fundamental to the greater narrative of the game, who have enough nuance to avoid being bland or forgettable, but they're both fundamentally likable enough that fans can find themselves loving the characters. Also, they're anthropomorphized animals who are, respectively, a mothering figure with loose-fitting robes, and a large, imposing, and strong man who is shown in at least one instance to also have a serious dad bod. So a lot of people make porn of them. It's also worth noting that these two haven't been strictly excluded from the boom in AU surrounding Undertale, as they are two characters who regularly receive detailed changes within these AUs. Plus, Toriel's unique connection to Sans established in their shared story means that a not insubstantial number of fans actually ship the two, which, while not universal by any means, is at least somewhat represented in the Sans Undertale phenomenon. However, I alluded that there are characters who establish their own sect of fans within the Undertale fandom that can be just as devoted as the Sans worshippers, but are completely separate from the skeleton. And while certainly there have been more than... I'll start that whole paragraph over again. However, I alluded that there are characters who establish their own sect of fans within the Undertale fandom that can be just as devoted as the Sans worshippers, but are completely separated from the skeleton. And while certainly there has been more than enough art drawn of Toriel for non-fans to notice, I wasn't so much talking about Toriel and Asgore as I was their children. Still good. So I should probably address something. You may have noticed that while referring to the main player character, or the player, or the main protagonist, I've tended to use very precise yet vague words. You may also be confused by my statements that the main protagonist is named Frisk, as the beginning of Undertale does give the player the option to input whatever name they want. However, that name isn't for the young, horizontal-eyed, yellow-skinned, frankly, poorly thought-out and designed character that the player controls for the entirety of the game. Instead, the character the player names at the beginning is the adopted child of Toriel and Asgore, the human sibling to Asriel and the first human to fall into the underground. This character is named by the player, but in general the community tends to refer to them either by one of a few nicknames based on their backstory, like the fallen child, the first human, or the demon, we'll get there, or by the name Kara, C-H-A-R-A, i.e. the first 5 letters of character. This is because the game basically considers this the character's default name. Kara is the failsafe name, is the... This is because the game basically considers this the character's default name. Kara is the failsafe name, is the... God. This is because the game basically considers this the character's default name. Kara is the failsafe name, if the player somehow skips the name entry section. Certain files in the game use this name to refer to the child, and inputting the name Kara in the name entry screen earns the player the message, the true name. So most fans just treat the name Kara as the canon name for them. Sort of like Link from most Legend of Zelda games, or the various canon names of RPG protagonists, or Minecraft Steve. Kara is definitely the closest character to Sans' level of reinterpretation within the fandom, though in their case it's largely because there just isn't a lot to go on in terms of what their actual backstory and personality are. We know they fell into the underground as a child, sometime during 2016, and that according to their adoptive brother Asriel, they might have had some very dark reasons and seemed to despise humanity, so we can probably assume they didn't have the best childhood. We knew the Dreamer family raised them for some period of time, during which they seemed genuinely happy and to generally love their adoptive family, but we don't really get any idea how long they lived down there other than they seemed to still be a child when they died. We know that they consumed buttercups in order to poison themselves, thus allowing Asriel to claim their soul and as a result cross the barrier, presumably so they could then kill 6 or 7 humans, return to the barrier and free the monsters. But it is somewhat possible that they lied about their intentions to Asriel just to get him to go along with the plan, and ultimately the plan failed because Asriel decided to resist, either allowing the humans to overpower them or simply allowing the humans to kill him. Finally, we know there seems to be some connection between Kara, the player, and Frisk, and that they are their own separate entity throughout, as their memories appear both as the game over sequence and briefly during a section in Waterfall where Frisk falls unconscious, not to mention their appearance at the end of the No Mercy route where they explain that they are the demon who comes when you call their name and that they gain more and more power as the player forces to slaughter every single monster in the underground. But we have no clue what the connection exactly is, how it happened, why it happened, when it happened, and whether or not Kara was always a demon powered by violence, or if this was a new development that occurred because the player killed literally everyone. There has been a lot of theorization, much of which I subscribe to, about Kara's greater role in the game, such as their role as narrator providing flavor text, their ultimate love of their adoptive family being complicated by the deep bitterness that resulted from their childhood trauma, and that ultimately they're basically just a kid who died and whose spirit somehow attached itself to this random kid who fell into the underground and, by extension, the player. These ideas are somewhat common within the fandom, but like Sans, they are subject to countless alternative interpretations. Though in this case, more in terms of what their deal is in canon, rather than what alternate canons could there be for them. Particularly popular interpretations are Kara as being a victim of abuse by family members or neighbors in early childhood, either emotional, physical, or sexual, and wanting to kill people in their home village as revenge for this mistreatment. Kara as a purely malevolent character, fundamentally evil from day one, and sometimes a literal demon whose intentions are the death and destruction of human monsters, or both. A somewhat sarcastic ghost who follows Frisk around on their journey and provides color commentary on various things that happen to and around them, which I may or may not have adapted into their characterization in one of my currently ongoing fics. A morally gray spirit, still tied to the world due to their connections to Asriel, often at least somewhat malicious toward Frisk and or the player for their actions taken in other timelines and or previous playthroughs, but still deeply connected to and caring for Asriel. or for some reason quite frequently a sexy adult seductive character, usually either a busty woman or a strong or skinny man, who was embroiled in a sort of slap kiss with an equally sexy and equally adult Frisk, who is whichever of the two options Kara is not at the moment occupying. The Undertale fandom is incredibly inexcusably horny, and I'm not sure anyone fully knows why. Maybe it's because the furries saw Toriel in the demo, or maybe Mettaton left an impression, who knows. Really wish they didn't bring it to characters who in the game are explicitly children, but if we need some faint praise to damn with, at least most art ages them up. So, yeah, if you're looking at characters with an Undertale that you can compare to Sans in terms of popularity, reinterpretation, or frankly bizarre and sometimes upsetting sexualization, Kara is probably your best bet. So, maybe they should have been the first or last character in this section, but I felt like it was important to establish the still living members of the Dreamer family before the dead children, and well, the actual last member acts as a good segue, and is arguably the most important member of the family in terms of the overall plot. This is Asriel Dreamer, whose name is both a combination of his parents' names and an anagram. This is Asriel Dreamer, whose name is both a combination of his parents' names and an anagram of serial murderer. He is the biological son of Toriel and Asgore, the adoptive sibling and best friend of Kara, and he has been dead for some uncertain amount of time, but it's probably safe to assume it's been years, if not decades, or even over a century. Despite this, Asriel is a major recurring character within the game, one of the first characters Frisk encounters in the Underground, arguably the primary antagonist of the entire plot, and the final boss of both the standard neutral playthrough and the true pacifist playthrough. This is because he is Flowey. See, in the backstory of the game, Alphys, who I should probably have mentioned before as the royal scientist of the Underground, began experimentation to try and find a way to destroy the barrier without necessarily needing to kill any more humans, presumably because Asgore noticed that all the humans that were entering the Underground were children for some reason, and he started feeling even shittier about the whole thing than he already did. In order to do this, Alphys began experimenting with a substance called determination, a seemingly real trait of human souls which give them our ability to continue existing after a human dies, which, as previously noted, isn't the case for most monsters. In addition to injecting monsters on their deathbed with this substance, which led to them briefly coming back to life and then, to her shock and horror, melting and eventually merging into one another and becoming amalgamate beings, like I said, not exactly a morally black and white character. She also realized that as humans cannot absorb human souls and monsters cannot absorb monster souls, for this plan to work, they would need a vessel which could hold both human and monster souls that could then use those souls to break the barrier. She chose a flower from the king's garden to be the vessel and injected it with determination, wondering what would happen if an inanimate being with no soul were suddenly given the will to live. However, well, when Asriel died, he was able to stumble back into the Underground, covered in seeds from the garden he was apparently going to lay Kara to rest in. Now, when monsters die, they turn to dust, because ultimately that's all they are. Dust with a soul held together by magic. In the Underground, it's tradition to sprinkle the dust of a deceased monster onto an item or items they held dear in life, sort of similar to the real-world practice of scattering ashes in a place of some significance. It is said that the sprinkling of dust allows the spirit of the monster to live on after their death. Well, it turns out that this was more literal than many would assume, as this flower turned out to have somehow obtained Asriel's memory, personality, and frankly, spirit, which became clear once the determination injection literally brought it to life. The problem was, he was brought back without a soul, meaning he lacked several, if not all, feelings he had felt while fully alive, most notably and explicitly the ability to feel love and connection to the people around him. This is why, when Frisk arrives in the Underground, he has become a nihilistic, homicidal asshole who proceeds to steal the 6 human souls at the end of a neutral run, and steals them as well as the souls of every single monster at the end of a pacifist run, and why he immediately becomes the player's only ally throughout the whole game if they perform a no mercy run. Well, that's part of the reason. See, it's very easy to frame this as very self-contained, in-universe story, which ends in the pacifist final boss when, having been restored to Asriel Dreamer through the power of every single soul in the Underground except for Frisk's, he develops the ability to love and feel again, and is overwhelmed by the sheer love all the monsters feel for Frisk in this moment, and, to an even greater extent, the love Frisk is showing towards him, culminating in him willingly destroying the barrier and surrendering all the souls, allowing for the story to have the happy ending it deserves, though he is unfortunately condemned to turn back into Flowey as he loses the power all the souls gave him. All of this on its own is a very easy to comprehend story about the pain of grief and loss and the ultimate power of love and forgiveness. But, well, I'm going to go over the overall lore and plot in chronological order to hopefully get across the big twist in all of this. I'm definitely going to repeat things I've hopefully made clear already, but bear with me because it's kind of important. Sometime after monsters were driven underground by human beings, the rulers of the monsters, King Asgore and Queen Toriel Dreamer, had a son by the name of Asriel Dreamer. In 2016, while Asriel was still a young child, a human child who we will call Kara. In 2016, while Asriel was still a young child, a human child, who we will call Kara, fell into the underground through a hole in Mount Evet and was discovered by Asriel. They were adopted by Asriel's parents and lived for some amount of time as a member of the Dreamer family. However, after a cooking accident in which Asriel and Kara mistook a cup of butter for the flower named Buttercups and accidentally almost poisoned Asgore, Kara came up with a plan to kill themselves so that Asriel could take their soul, exit the underground, and kill enough humans to destroy the barrier that trapped all monsters. However, Asriel expressed hesitation and doubt, and while Kara had partial control of his body while he held their soul, he was able to resist enough that they didn't actually kill any humans, and in fact Asriel began to die, barely managing to drag himself and Kara back to the throne room of the underground, where he dissolved into dust. Some years later, Dr. Alphys, experimenting with a mysterious substance known as determination, which seems to have effects on the very nature of life and death, accidentally resurrected Asriel in the form of a flower who later took the name Flowey. Flowey was disheartened to realize he could no longer feel love, and in a combination of this despair, the grief of having lost Kara, and the guilt that he had somehow ruined their plan, he somehow managed to kill himself. Then, and this is the important bit, he rewound time? As a result of having determination, Flowey was able to rewind time on the moment of his death, allowing him to change what he did in the past. Emboldened by this, he began experimenting, first attempting to make life better for the people of the underground, but eventually growing bored and simply doing whatever he felt like, up to and including committing acts of mass murder upon the monsters of the underground, for no better reason than because he could. However, eventually Frisk fell into the underground, and shortly afterwards, Flowey realized he could no longer go back in time on his own, as Frisk had taken that power away from him. Mistaking Frisk for Kara due to their similarities, he begins observing them and following them through the underground. Oh, also, at some point he started referring to the world he lived in with video game terminology. So, in case you haven't picked up on it, there's kind of a disconnect here between the slightly more fantastical, but still grounded in some logic lore of the Dreamer family, the tragedy of Asriel and Kara, and the existential horror behind not being able to feel any form of compassion, sympathy, or love, versus the almost sci-fi, heavily meta-narrative around the ability of individuals with excessive determination to time travel, usually prompted by death. Admittedly, the disconnect is less prominent in-game, as the elements of time travel and the odd nature of saving and reloading is established very early on, well before the piecemeal elements of the Dreamer's backstory, and the two are sort of interspersed evenly, but looking at it chronologically, it is odd. It could almost be read as an in-universe collision of more scientific ideas like the multiverse and the inherently fantastical story of a society of monsters trapped underground, simply being expressed and communicated through a metaphorical lens of video game mechanics, if it weren't for Flowey constantly making reference to very specific, very external concepts such as save files, loading games, and even starting and quitting the game. Not to mention the game's explicit statement and expression of the separation between Frisk, Kara, and the player, and the fact that the player, literally the human being sitting at a computer or in front of a game console, is an external force affecting the world of game, and that at least one or two individuals within said world would really rather the player not be there. That's also true of Sans, to get back to what this rambling mess is ostensibly supposed to be about. It's easy to assume, based on him talking about timelines and his apparent interest in subjects like time travel and quantum mechanics, that Sans is just a scientific mind and a part of the odd sci-fi collision, and his references to EXP and stats are simply in-universe expressions of things that happen to line up with standard game mechanics for the player's benefit. The problem with that is, it's very clearly a lot more real than that. While Sans can't keep track of exactly who you killed, or even exactly how many people you killed, presumably because Toby Fox already developed a disability with the amount he worked on this game without putting that much work into an optional dialogue, he can still respond to specific levels the player can reach, and even knows that there is a maximum level of 20, so it's clear that this isn't just the old trick of him guessing based on a look in your eyes. So, what the hell is going on? Why can characters see they're in a game? What are we doing playing the game? And who the hell is Dr. Gaster? I think I'm gonna break this up into 2 recordings because holy shit. Lalelulelo. Lalelulelo. Ohio. Okay. Oh, you thought this was a video about Sans being a Tumblr sexy man? Fuck you. I explained ecto-penises and fauncets and the fucking underage shit, so I get to infant up about my shit. I get to ramble about the mystery man, and you have to listen to it. That's the deal. That's my fucking reward for this bullshit. Okay. Within the game files for Undertale, there are 3 files with information about the player's saved game. File 9, which manages certain hidden autosaves throughout the game. File 0, which stores the world data of the game at actual in-game save points. And the configuration file simply labeled Undertale, which simply displays similar information to File 0, but with more easily understandable labels and characters. Within these files, there is a value which the Undertale.ini labels as fun. This fun value is randomly generated when first starting a run of the game, between 1 and 100, and depending on what the number is, varies FA. This fun value is randomly generated when first starting a run of the game, between 1 and 100, and depending on what the number is, various events can trigger within the game. The majority of these are fairly innocuous, mostly being small Easter eggs that don't have much effect on the game's actual story. However, there are 5 or 6 of these events that are notable. Three events have a random chance of triggering if the player enters certain rooms in Hotland when the fun value is set to 61, 62, or 63, with each event being tied to a specific value. These events are the appearance of a monochromatic character who previously didn't exist in the space, each labeled in the game's code as G-follower, or in some cases, Gaster follower. 2 of these characters, follower 1 and 2, who have a 50 and 20% chance of appearing respectively if the values are set to 62 or 61, again, respectively, are recolored versions of other characters who appear elsewhere in Hotland. The third, follower 3, has a 50% chance of appearing if the fun value is 63, and looks like this. Yeah. Each of these characters discusses a character who otherwise is never mentioned in the game, known as Dr. W.D. Gaster, the former royal scientist for the Underground who created the core that acts as the penultimate area of a neutral and no mercy run. I'll let you judge them for yourselves. So, yeah. The general idea is that at some point in the past, Dr. Gaster fell into one of his creations after an experiment went wrong, and was somehow killed and possibly scattered across time and space. It's worth noting that technically there is no confirmation that the creation he fell into was the core. It's implied, as the same follower who mentions him building the core is the one who says he fell into his creation, but it is entirely possible this is just because there are only 3 followers to put this info into, and the relationship is still pretty circumstantial. Also, the sound that played when the follower 2, the one that rhymed, made when he disappeared? Yeah, keep that sound effect in mind. It's going to be important pretty soon. Now, there are 2 more major rooms accessible while the fun value is in the 60s. The first is at value 65, where there is a 50% chance after beating Papyrus of entering a new, otherwise inaccessible room when exiting the room with the first box in the game to the north. Upon entering this room, the player is greeted with a sound test, akin to, say, Sonic the Hedgehog or Kirby. Of course, this being Undertale, none of the sounds in the room appear elsewhere in the game, and also 3 of the 4 available are only about a second long before immediately looping. The 4th, however, is a much longer and more complicated song, with a simple but effective melody line. However, once selecting and playing this song, moving around in the sound test menu remains possible, but selecting any other sound is disabled, and after playing the song for about 20 seconds, the game will place the player back in the room that is normally accessible through that path. Notably, the track is identified in the game's sound files as mus_st_him, but the sound test room simply identifies it as Gaster's theme. Finally, we have fun value 66, which contains the rarest fun value event, despite being guaranteed to activate an event when input. Having fun value 66 creates a hallway within Waterfall, with the game then having a 10% chance of generating a door in that hallway when the player enters. Note that entering and then exiting the hallway will always reset the fun value to 0. If the door does spawn, entering it sends the player to a room known internally as the Mystery Man room. And this is the Mystery Man. Hello! Now, if you're sort of on the fringes of the fandom, you may have seen people very confidently state that this character is Gaster, which, maybe? As we'll get into in a second, the fact that the value has to be 66 already connects this character to Gaster a fair amount, and interacting with him results in him disappearing with the same sound effect playing as with Follower 2. Also, that sound effect, when reversed and slowed down, is actually the melody of Gaster's theme, at least partially. Also, there's one other reason people point to this as being Gaster's possible appearance, but we'll get into that soon enough. Now, all of this was intriguing, especially because it wasn't clear how connected it all was, both each element to each other and the whole thing to the main game. Even the other fun value events were ambiguous, as well as some, such as values 90 through 100, which spawned a character who strongly resembled the Gaster followers, and the most common event of the wrong number song for values 2 through 39, which mentions a character whose name starts with G, could be interpreted as relating to Gaster. The evidence in both cases is somewhat circumstantial, as neither is referred to in the game files with the same kind of language as the Gaster followers, or other events, like a weird snowman appearing on the one-off joke word search didn't seem to have any connection to Gaster whatsoever, though put a pin in that, will ya? I'm re-recording all this after having hotcakes this morning. That's weird things to my mouth. For more information, fans went through the code of the game and found a lot. One discovery was that despite no battle with Gaster being possible in-game, even with entities fans believe could be the Doctor, his stats were in fact available in the game files. The script for monster setup lists him at the bottom as monster number 666, with an HP of 666,666, an attack and defense of 66,666, and an XP and gold reward upon defeat of negative 6,666 each. All of which indicates either an extreme connection between Gaster and the number 6, or that Toby wanted to make the character even more unsettling, so he just spammed the Satan number as much as possible. It's worth noting that monster number 66 is a brief encounter in the No Mercy route, and number 6 is just the weird jiggling jello that is Boltzball, neither of which have any connection to Gaster. More infamous was Entry 17, which I probably need to explain. In the past of this route, the player gains access to Alphys' true laboratory, where they discover both the Amalgamates, these frankly kind of disturbing characters who straddle a line between life and death, and the backstory regarding Alphys, these monsters, and Flowey. There's also, like, a room with VHS tapes that gives the player more backstory on the Dreamer family and reveals exactly what Kara and Azrael's plan was, but that's not important right now. See, the way the player learns the backstory is through entries in Alphys' journal, I think. Entries 1 through 21 can be found throughout the True Lab, with the exception of entry number 17, which bridges the gap between Alphys beginning to panic at something going wrong and her revelation that the flower she was experimenting on has disappeared. Now, within the game's code, there are actually 2 different candidates for entry 17, neither being accessible in-game. The first is a fairly understandable entry, presumably made by Alphys about the Amalgamates, that is basically just her explaining what happened and why. It's entirely possible this was originally going to be in the game, but was cut when Toby decided that it would be better to leave what happened unstated until the player actually finds Alphys, making this pretty normal cut content. The other entry 17 is, this. So, translated from Wingdings, the text reads, entry number 17, dark, darker, yet darker. Darkness keeps growing, the shadows cutting deeper, photons readings negative. This next experiment seems very, very interesting. What do you two think? This entry can be found if, through hacking, the player accesses room 264 in-game, also known internally as room Gaster. This has led most to assume that this entry was written by Gaster himself, and as the text is in Wingdings, his first 2 initials are WD, and the game has 2 characters already named after fonts whose text is in those fonts, it's also generally assumed his full name is in fact Dr. Wingding Gaster, or sometimes Wingdings Gaster, or occasionally even Wingden Gaster or Wingding Aster, as Aster is in itself a font, and so it would be very easy to add the last G from Wingding to it to make its last name. It's also generally assumed from this information that Gaster is in fact a skeleton, as the only characters named after fonts in the game are the skeletons, hence why this character that looks vaguely skeleton-like is often pegged as Gaster himself. Now it should be noted that while this is widely accepted, none of it can be explicitly confirmed from the game, and many have pointed to a different character in a fully inaccessible room known internally as Waterfall Redacted as the actual Gaster, since interacting with them creates text in lowercase wingdings, and exiting the room leads to the previously mentioned sound test room with Gaster's theme. Personally, I think if we're arguing about canon, the Mystery Man is more likely to be intended as the true lead to work off of, since while it's difficult to access, it is possible with much less modification, and post a patch to the fund values is actually accessible without editing files at all. Though this is admittedly only a 0.1% chance overall. Meanwhile, the redacted character is completely inaccessible without extensive hacking. Meanwhile, the redacted character is completely inaccessible without extensive hacking, including adjusting the game's error detection. This isn't to say that the redacted character isn't important to the mystery, or even that it isn't Gaster. It just means that for fans just casually looking for an explanation or portrayal of the character, it's generally going to be easier for them to find and identify the character who only requires adjusting some text files, as opposed to a character who can only be found by breaking into some .win files that require dedicated programs to even look into. Speaking of the .win file containing sprites, sound effects, and strings of text, there is just a lot. Even before opening it, the folder contains an audio file named abc123a.ogg, which when the game released contained multiple text-to-speech voices asking players who found the files to not spoil the game and not post about anything they found in the files online, or else, and I quote, "I won't make any more secrets, no one will be impressed, it will be your fault." Then the voices laugh. As of the game's first real update, version 1.001, the file is just the text-to-speech laughter. In the data.win file, there was a lot of data that wasn't accessible, including fairly nondescript test rooms and unreferenced files, as well as things like a fully programmed room in which something is apparently stalking the player, or a series of strings that include an oath of devotion from a mysterious individual to an unknown person, interspersed with the lines Demon A, Demon B, Demon C, and Demon D, that is referenced in a script called Attention Hackers Number 2. The music used in Gaster's entry 17 is named Smile, which who even knows what interpretation that supports. There are sprites that indicate a very different early version of the game, including a button for a spell command, and there was a font in the file whose display name is Mars Nate Cunnilingus. I don't know what's a clue, what's a coincidence, and what's a remnant of Toby writing. I don't know what's a clue, what's a coincidence, and what's a remnant of Toby working on this project since he was only 20. It's a lot. So, I know what you're thinking. Sorio, you've really gone off the rails this time. This is supposed to be a video about the Sans fandom, and now you're just rambling about something that's just a niche, tangential part of Undertale. Most Sans fans wouldn't even be able to tell you who Alphys was. What could this possibly have to do with Sans Undertale? Well, first off, that's very rude. A lot of Sans fans know who Alphys is, they just don't care all that much. And second, oh, you naive fool. Do you truly think so little of me? So little of this world? This is no loose tangent. This isn't a random association. I assure you, Dr. Gaster has everything to do with the phenomenon of Sans Undertale. This is over. So, I mentioned before that the Sans fight at the end of the No Mercy route is a trip. In addition to making references that seem to indicate he either was or still is part of a larger group investigating things, he uses varied attacks. There are, of course, a lot of bone-based attacks, much like the fight with Papyrus, and he rather infamously messes with the gravity affecting the player's soul. However, one of the first attacks he uses is a weird laser coming out of an animal skull. The design here, specifically the odd-looking skull, is somewhat evocative of various objects in the game, but it still stands out compared to most attacks seen throughout. Going into the game's files again, this object is named a Gaster Blaster. Like, I know there's more detail to go into with the blasters, but like, do I need to? We've literally found a smoking gun! First off, we should rewind a bit to a character that technically doesn't exist, even more than Gaster. In the planning stages of Undertale, there was apparently a character created called Grandpa Semi. Not much is known about him, since he was apparently cut early into the game, but there is a lot of speculation. Various details from different demos indicates he may have been planned to have Alphys' role, at least in one or two specific situations like a phone call, and fans have theorized he may have been intended as Sans of Papyrus' grandfather, since Semi could be referenced as Semi-Seraph, and a piece of Papyrus' early design documents, aka some godly rule paper Fox scribbled some ideas on, has areas of blocked out text that indicate he may have had another family member besides Sans, but none of this is confirmed, and honestly, whatever his original character was is generally less important than the fact that he was cut, and at least one reference to him, a short sound clip named Grandpa Semi, was still in the game files when the games had first released. Also said sound clip sounds a lot like the opening to Metal Crusher, Mettaton's first song in the game, to add further speculation to the pile. Also, the clip was reworked in version 1.001 to be called Grandpa Temmie, and plays in a situation in the Temmie Sop. So, as mentioned, there is one character who can be found by editing the fun values that is very reminiscent of the Gaster followers, but isn't technically referenced in-game as one of them. The character, identified internally as Goner Kid, is a monochromatic recolor of the character Monster Kid, who can be found if the fun value is between 90 and 100. There have been people who have disputed the idea that Goner Kid is in fact related to Gaster or the followers, as they never explicitly reference Gaster, and their fun value can be multiple numbers, and has a 100% chance of making them appear, unlike the followers. And also the internal name Goner Kid isn't as clear a connection as Gaster follower, also because their fun values aren't in the 60s, though I'd argue since they encompass the entirety of the 90s, and really 9 is just 6 but flipped upside down, this is kind of weaker evidence. In any case, most people nowadays agree that Connor Kidd is, if not a direct Gaster follower, at least somewhat connected to the Doctor. Partly for reasons we'll discuss later that seemingly debunk a lot of claims of their separation and provide a greater through line to Gaster from them, and also partly because, come on, just look at them. The character is literally the exact formula of two of the followers, and they say weird cryptic stuff. And while not all of the fun value stuff can be explicitly connected to Gaster, the majority of it definitely can. Anyways. Connor Kidd spawns in a room in Waterfall. Speaking to them, the player gets the sense that something is wrong. They talk about this sort of existential horror of a world in which everyone has forgotten about you, a world where you never existed, and yet everything else is almost exactly the same. Everyone is still perfectly fine, even though you were never born. Speaking to them while holding an umbrella, they will note that it isn't raining in that room, laugh, thank the player, and then ask the player to forget about them, to not think about them again. It might be worth noting that the character GK is a recolor of Monster Kid, is a major player in Waterfall who mentions having not only parents, but a sister, none of whom are named or seen in-game. So, there are two general conclusions about what Gaster's story is about. One for what may have actually happened in universe, and one for what it means in real life and where the idea maybe came from. The in-universe conclusion is pretty much just what the followers discussed, but with added details based on various context clues. Dr. Gaster was at one point the royal scientist for the Underground. He was smart, seemingly respected, and extremely accomplished, having built the core which keeps most of the Underground running. It's worth noting that it's not 100% clear what exactly the core was meant to do. Like, it's clearly a power plant, and it provides some kind of electricity or energy to the underground, but despite running off heat and being geothermal, it needs ice regularly, presumably to keep from overheating, and also the internals are completely changeable, with rooms being able to move around, and there's a lot of semi-religious imagery with symbolism relating to the symbols monsters use to signify their hope of escape, the Deltarune, which we'll get to. But in any case, he built the core, but at some point while conducting an experiment, he fell into his creation, generally agreed to be the core, or if not the core itself, something connected to the core. This accident led to Gaster essentially being broken across time and space in that moment, and also essentially erased from existence in the past. The only characters who explicitly reference Gaster in dialogue generally can't be accessed without altering game files and getting some degree of luck, while the best possibility for a character who might actually be Gaster is locked behind a 1 in 10 chance with file editing and a 1 in 1,000 chance without. One of the only characters who may in fact remember Gaster is King Asgore, who the followers claim took a long time to replace Gaster, though it's not 100% clear if this is literal or even accurate, but does seem to possess some knowledge of the time manipulation and lack of death in Frisk, as using the talk command in his battle after he's killed the player at least once has Frisk outright tell him that he's killed them before, and he doesn't appear to be shocked by this news, but instead simply solemn. This is all pretty ambiguous, of course, and it is both possible that Asgore doesn't remember Gaster whatsoever, or that the majority of underground inhabitants remember Gaster but don't talk about him because, people who talk about him tend to literally disappear. The only character who is concretely assumed to know who Gaster is, at least based on the name of his weaponry, is Sans. In addition to wielding a weapon literally called a Gaster Blaster, his No Mercy boss battle includes many references to an apparent team tracking very scientific matters, and Sans himself appears to want to go back, not to the surface, but to before something happened, though admittedly he might just mean to before you killed literally everyone he knows and loves. Now, in a pacifist route, there are actually additional Easter eggs the player can find regarding Sans. I mentioned before how during the judgment, if the player reloads their save after the first judgment speech, they can receive a more detailed, in-depth analysis of their level. Well, if the player gained no XP and no love and does this trick, they can enter an interesting conversation loop with Sans, in which he notes they seem to be a time traveler, and eventually he'll give them the key to his bedroom. His bedroom, by the way, is framed as something of a mystery if and when the player first enters his and Papyrus's house, having strange lights coming from the bottom and being one of the few firmly locked doors in the game. Actually entering his room with the key basically reveals he was trolling the player. That's not the interesting part, though. See, if the player goes around to the back of the brother's house, they can find another locked door leading to some kind of basement. This appears to be Sans' workshop, and contains indecipherable blueprints, photos that indicate both Sans' friendship with people Frisk never meets, and somehow taking a photo with the rest of the main cast even right after the moment they all finally meet in the pacifist run, and a mysterious machine in the corner of the room that seems to be both broken and non-functional. Also, there's a badge in one of the drawers, which leads idiots to believe Sans is actually Ness. I'm trying to be respectful of people's theories and headcanons, but god, MatPat is just dumb. The existence of this workshop seemingly deepens the connection between Sans and science, which was already something of a theme, as one item in the main living room of his house is a quantum mechanics book, inside a joke book, inside a quantum mechanics book, inside a joke book, and so on and so forth. This leads to the theory that when Gaster still existed, Sans actually worked alongside him, either as a peer or as an assistant. It is, or more accurately was, pretty much always assumed that Sans was one of the two referenced in Gaster's entry 17, with the other one either being Alphys or in some cases Papyrus. It's also very common, though disputed, theory that Gaster is related to Sans and Papyrus in terms of family. This reaches back to the character of Grandpa Semi, and the idea that the brothers did, at one point in development, have another family member involved in the story. Exactly what the relationship is depends on interpretation, with some framing Gaster as still their grandfather or instead their uncle or cousin, but the most common... Gonna start the sentence over. Exactly what the relationship is depends on interpretation, with some framing Gaster as still their grandfather or instead their uncle or cousin, but the most common interpretation is that Gaster is their father. Mostly because people have an easier time processing a missing or dead dad plotline and getting angst and drama from that than, say, a dead grandfather. Like, a lot of people have at least one dead grandfather before they reach their 30s. It's not that angsty. There isn't actually that much evidence in the game of any sort of family ties, and the only real connection to Gaster that Papyrus has is that one line player can hear if they abort a No Mercy run with Papyrus mentions that his special attack would have, quote, blasted them, implying that his special attack might involve or even be at least one Gaster blaster, but this is pretty circumstantial, and the line was only added in an update to the game. As for why Alphys is sometimes tagged as the second in entry 17, that's mostly because she's also a scientist, so people assume that she probably worked with or for Gaster at some point. It's worth noting that if one accepts the connection between Sans and Gaster, as well as the connection to Alphys established by their jobs, 2 or 3 of these seemingly unconnected fun events actually do tie into Gaster. If the fun value is between 40 and 45, Sans will call the... If the fun value is between 40 and 45, Sans will call the protagonist in Snowden with a twist on the old "is your refrigerator running" prank call, and if it's between 46 and 50, Alphys will call in Snowden before you even meet her, and try to order a pizza. I'd also note that there are odd enemies in the True Lab, Memory Heads, who, unlike the other amalgamates, don't seem to be connected to any other monsters in the underground, and actually seem to talk through the player's phone, which is interesting. A much more explicitly funny and random event is Nightmare Mode, where if the fun value is 56 or 57, the word search Sans gives the player in Snowden has an additional character named Nightmare on it. This one isn't really a clue, and the only real connection to Gaster is that Sans is the one providing the puzzle, but I wanted to bring it up for the sake of completeness, and also because it is pretty funny. So, I mentioned that all of this is the in-universe idea of what happened to Gaster, and while there are other fandom topics to touch on, like the idea that he's reconstituting, or the question of how much he knew about the whole "it's a game" thing, or especially the weird collective agreement on the wording of "the void," a phrase that, to my knowledge, doesn't even appear in-game at all, let alone connected to Gaster. But I feel the most important thing we need to address is why. Why is any of this happening? Why did Toby put any of this in the game? Why is this so well hidden and cryptic? There's this concept in game design and game analysis of an element being dummied out. The exact definition of the term is disputed, but at a base level they refer to the idea of something being removed from a game. The more common usage, as seen by TV tropes, is the idea of removing something not by completely deleting it from the game data, but instead by removing the ability of the game to reference or call for those elements in normal gameplay, as well as, in some cases, removing some other parts of the removed element, such as certain graphics or broad functionality. Sonic 2, for example, originally included a level called Hidden Palace Zone, elements of which still technically exist within the game's data, but the level can't be reached in standard gameplay. And even if you use a cheat device to get into it, the level doesn't actually work properly, because most of the graphics and all the collision data has been removed. Presumably the reason so much is still present in the game's files is because the level was removed so late in development, they didn't have time to remove literally everything about it, or some element that remained was crucial to the stability of either the full game, or at least another important aspect of it. There are examples of this in Undertale as well, if the player goes through the previously mentioned data.win file. The sprite for a spell button, unused sprites of either Frisk or Kara, items that don't appear anywhere in game. All of these elements are wholly inaccessible within the game itself, but they still exist within the files. One of these, as previously mentioned, was data relating to Grandpa Semi, prominently including a song that wasn't fully removed. See, remember that sound test room I mentioned a while back? In Sonic 2, one of the first clues players received about Hidden Palace Zone was the sound test for the game, which included a song that wasn't actually used anywhere else in the game. And Undertale is a game that loves to fuck with players who know a lot about video games. The common consensus is that Gaster, out of the universe, was intended as an exploration of the sort of existential horror of something, or indeed someone, being dummied out of a game. Likely inspired by Grandpa Semi and possibly inspired by other elements removed from the final game, Gaster is intended as a very meta way of addressing the topic of a character being cut from a game, and the game still being, well, a complete game. That idea Goner Kid mentioned, the concept of the world going on just fine without your existence, isn't just what Gaster is going through, it's what any character cut from a video game before these would experience. Were they actually alive? Elements like a character's attack sprite still referencing this now lost element, songs that don't actually appear anywhere in the game, even the fact that so much of this information is only available by either editing the game's file or diving deep into the game's code, all of this points to a deliberate reference to various dummied out elements. This actually lends greater credence to the theory that Gaster didn't just die or end up broken across space-time, but was actively erased from the past and the present. It's like there's a separate layer of reality between ours and the game, where the game's creator decided that Gaster wasn't actually important beyond the existence of the core, so they just removed Gaster and kept the core unexplained. All of this, the meta-narrative, the thematic implications, and even the possible connection to the in-universe acknowledgement of saving and loading is, frankly, fascinating on its own. But it's also very interesting in how this layer of the game, how this aspect of the story, ended up influencing the fandom of Sans. Yeah, this is a video about the Sans fandom, remember? I know it's been over 5,000 words since I started talking about the man who speaks in hands, but I promise this all does connect back to Sans. See, you might have noticed when I was talking about alternate universe Sans versions that one or two I mentioned were fucked up and weird. Like, okay, maybe someone keyed into internet culture would just accept 90s cool kid stereotype, but actually an eldritch abomination is, ironic teams being ironic. But, like, as far as I'm aware, the Onceler fandom made a fucked up because the T pre... Like, okay, maybe someone keyed into internet culture would just accept 90s cool kid stereotype, but actually an eldritch abomination is, ironic teens being ironic. But, like, as far as I'm aware, the Onceler fandom never made a fucked up because the tape reel got partially destroyed version of the character. Tony the Talking Clock was seen as fucked up and creepy because he was a murderous teacher, not because he was a puppet in a web series. No one ever wrote a fic where Wheatley yells at the reader for getting off to his suffering, you know? You would assume, the internet being what it is, the meta-narrative elements would just be completely ignored by the Sans fandom. And to be fair, some work kinda does. Like, a lot of fiction comics and fan art just explore various surface levels within the AUs. Like, Undertale mostly just sticks to the concept of Sans as essentially the flowery standard. But a lot of works also don't. there is a surprising amount of inter-AU crossover where the characters acknowledge the fact that they are fundamentally fan creations based on a pre-existing character. The fact that Sans is implied to, if not remember the different timelines, at least be well aware that they exist and some of what happened in them, is explored in a good majority of fics based around the character. While the irreverent, prankish side of the character is loved and utilized a lot, especially his enjoyment of bad puns, the deep drama of having this friend or colleague or potentially even family member who no longer exists because of being beyond their comprehension decided he wasn't adding enough to the story isn't just pushed aside, it's accentuated. It's almost a meme how the fandom treats Sans as more clearly suffering from his depression than he ever actually does in-game, because people really do enjoy and explore that aspect of his character. It is worth noting that it is entirely possible that an interest in this aspect of the character is what got him so much attention, which is what led to the emergence of a fanbase just for him. It's also worth noting that while the fanbases can be disconnected, they largely aren't. Fans who are interested in Undertale become interested in Sans because of the mystery surrounding the character, while fans exclusively of Sans take an interest in Undertale for how it can flesh out the world around him. Gaster researchers dig deep into what connection the character has to Sans, while Sans fans dig deep into Gaster because of how important the connection is. People who love the Dreamer family question the relationships they have with Sans, and fans of Sans are drawn to characters like Sorio and Flowey who seem to have experiences with him. It's not so much the Ouroboros of a snake eating its own tail as it is the idea of two snakes eating each other's tail, forming the same or a similar closed loop. So that's basically the story of Undertale, the Undertale fandom, and the dedicated fandom surrounding Sans, at least for the first 3 or so years of the game's release. The game, critically acclaimed as it was, drew attention for its fandom in particular, how obsessed a large majority of the fandom was with the character of Sans. The general reaction is largely a sort of backhanded fascination. A few elements became mimetic, specifically the ecto-dick phenomenon and the music behind Sans' boss fight. Fox has already established and much-loved song Melovania, but by and large the whole thing is treated more as an internet oddity than anything else. The character of Sans became mimetic again due to Kanye West's copyright-striking video game remixes that sampled his music, leading to a remix of Asgore's boss theme with the lyrics "Kanye West likes big fingers in his ass," with the common visual being a 3D animated dance featuring Sans, as well as a Major Danganronpa character Nagito Kameda, though this meme largely stays within the confines of Tumblr. Toby would continue working largely as a composer, providing music for the end of Homestuck as well as several side projects of the Homestuck franchise, though nowhere near as much as in the years prior to Undertale's release, possibly because post-Undertale, there just wasn't a lot of Homestuck with music. In 2017, a PS4 version of Undertale was released, featuring some differences in the platform change, including borders for the game's display, adjustments for the game's different control style and console, and general differences between the experience of playing a game in a window on a computer and that of playing it on a console, presumably through a TV. This also included the addition of PlayStation trophies, accessed primarily through donating money to a shrine to the This also included the addition of PlayStation trophies, accessed primarily through donating money to a shrine to the annoying dog, possibly a tongue-in-cheek reference to a PlayStation port being seen as a cash grab, and possibly because Undertale does not suit achievements very well as a game, as seen by the other achievements including such entries as "Don't worry, I have lots of ideas for trophies," like getting items, or getting more items. Help me, I'm out of ideas. For the record, since we probably aren't going to discuss it at all later, the Xbox version of the game converts this to a casino, and those item achievements are replaced with slot machine achievements. I think Toby just has an odd sense of humor. By and large, while the Undertale fandom stayed strong through the years, the internet as a whole somewhat lost interest over time, both in Undertale and the Sans phenomenon. Like, on one hand, Sans Undertale was still occasionally used as shorthand for weird fan obsession, but on the other hand, the game launched like a few months after Trump announced he was running for president. Most of the internet had enough to fight about already. Even the Undertale fandom itself, while mostly still invested, began to drift slightly as the game's third anniversary drew closer. Outside of a few interesting updates, there just wasn't that much new to discuss. And even the drama was mostly just a few big-name fans disagreeing on certain things and people being understandably creeped out by all the underage shit. It honestly seemed like the phenomenon was almost done. Then 2018 happened. Let's see. Hey, almost 40 minutes just for that. So, in September 2018, a Nintendo Switch port of Undertale was released, which, as I'll get into near the end of this video, was a pretty big deal. The Switch port currently stands as the version of the game with the most changes. While the Dog Shrine was vandalized and destroyed, the area now includes an optional bonus boss accessible after a certain point in the game, and the addition of 2 new borders to the selection. While both, especially the former, are very interesting, probably one of the most noteworthy changes for fans was, well, the Clam Girl. So, in terms of the fun values and the events they can trigger, there's one we haven't discussed yet, and that's the Clam Girl. If the fun value is between 80 and 89, an additional NPC can be found in Waterfall, near Undyne's house, who appears similar to a minor NPC in Hotland. She mentions coming from the city and says that Frisk looks about the same age as her neighbor's daughter, Suzy, S-U-Z-Y. The name is highlighted in yellow, similar to important characters and concepts throughout the game, and she notes that the players should be friends with Suzy, even saying if the player talks to her again that, in the grand scheme of things, Suzy might be the reason the player came here in the first place. If you kill Undyne, she will instead say the player should leave that girl alone, and if you talk to her again in the true pacifist ending, she'll note that you didn't meet Suzy, but that's okay since there are only so many things you can do in a day. So, I didn't bring this up before since it's really weird, and there doesn't really seem to be a connection to anything at first. There is no character named Suzy in the game, and this one line where she mentions her is the only There is no character named Suzy in the game, and this one line where she mentions her is the only instance of the name even appearing in the code. It's frankly bizarre with pretty much no explanation in the game. Now, as you might imagine, the Switch port is more difficult to alter the fun value, since most Nintendo Switches don't allow you to go into game files and change certain variables. If you want to get a certain value for the variable, you basically have to reset the game and then try to find evidence that it was set to the value you wanted, which is especially tricky if, say, you're trying to activate an event past the midpoint of the game that only has a random chance of working right even if you do get the right value. So, naturally, Toby made things even more complicated. On Switch, there is a slight change to the Clam Girl scenario, but only if the fun value is 81 exactly, and the change is to the true pacifist ending. In other words, you have a 1 in 10 chance of getting the Clam Girl in Waterfall, then you have to play all the way to the very last ending of the game just to see if you got the additional. In other words, you have a 1 in 10 chance of getting the Clam Girl in Waterfall, then you have to play all the way to the very last ending of the game just to see if you got the additional 1 in 10 chance of getting one value out of the 10 Clam here can appear in. Now, obviously, if you have a hacked Switch or even just transfer the game data over to a computer, you can make things easier for yourself, but still, the point is very clearly for this to be a very rare event. So, you've got all of that just right. On the Nintendo Switch version of the game exclusively, the Clam Girl's dialogue changes in order to assure the player that the time they and Suzy will meet, quote, is fast approaching. When she says those words, she changes to an entirely different sprite, referred to internally as Clam Goner, implying a director. When she says those words, she changes to an entirely different sprite, referred to internally as Clam Goner, implying a direct connection to Goner Kid, and then vanishes with the same sound as Gaster Follower 2 and the Mystery Man that fans had been theorizing for years by this point was Gaster. Again, that sound clip is a variation on Gaster's theme. So not only did this provide a direct through line of Goner Kid to Clam Goner to Gaster Follower to Gaster, but it also meant that, with maybe the exception of Nightmare Mode, there was at least theoretical link between every single event triggered by fun values and Dr. W.D. Gaster. This was big. Fans began speculating what this meant, if they had missed anything else, if this meant the Switch port was holding some other big secrets they didn't know about. It was a big deal. Then, on October 30th, we got answers. And a whole lot of questions. So, yeah, that happened. This was huge. Not only was something major happening on the official Undertale Twitter, but it seemed a whole hell of a lot like we were getting direct contact from Dr. Gaster himself, telling us to come back on Halloween. Nobody knew what was going on, but everyone was excited. Deltarune Chapter 1 released on October 31st, 2018. The game primarily follows the player character, Chris, discovering a brand new world alongside their classmate, Susie, S-U-S-I-E. No, we don't know why the spelling difference yet, just go along with it. The pair end up accidentally falling into the Dark World, another side of reality filled with beings made of darkness, whose primary interest seems to be the blue. The pair end up accidentally falling into the Dark World, another side of reality filled with beings made of darkness, whose primary entrance seems to be the broom closet of their school. The game changes a lot of the gameplay and UI from Undertale, while still fundamentally staying the same core game. The bullet hell style dodging system remains pretty much the same, but it's more common for enemies to play around in the space surrounding the attacks, rather than just staying inside a motionless square the whole time. As for the attacking and sparing side of the equation, the biggest change from Undertale is the introduction of a party system. In addition to controlling Chris, the player also controls their allies in battle, specifically the darker character Rouse and, later in the game, Susie. Notably, while all three characters can fight and spare, only Chris is able to act, at least in Chapter 1, with Susie and Rousey instead having access to spells. However, Chris can command their party members to act, which typically allows the player to put more enemies into a state where they can be spared. At once. This adds a very interesting dynamic to even pure pacifist fights, especially since there are far fewer occasions in this game where the player is only against one enemy. If you have multiple enemies, you can choose an action that will make one of them spareable, and then in that same turn, spare them so you don't have to deal with their attacks, or you can use an action with multiple characters to make multiple enemies spareable next turn, but put yourself in the line of fire during the dodging portion. Additionally, two additional mechanics added in are putting enemies to sleep and, well, Susie being chaotic. The former is essentially an extension of a somewhat underused mechanic in Undertale, where you can make an enemy spareable by attacking them non-fatally. Here, if you do this and make an enemy tired, you can use Rousey's Pacify spell to put the enemy to sleep. As for Susie, a notable problem for a good portion of the chapter is that Susie is technically a part of your party, but she can't be directly controlled, always attacking enemies no matter what tactics the player is using. As a result, while she's in this state, it's essentially required for the player to spend the first turn of each fight warning the enemies that they need to avoid her, assuming the player is going for a pacifist run. This all makes the gameplay a lot more complicated and less simple than Undertale, but also leaves it a fair bit more tactical and engaging, at least in my opinion. The story is largely disconnected from Undertale, though put a pin in that because it's complicated, but it does explore similar themes, including the value of pacifism, the questions of what it means to care about other people, and what responsibility we have to treat others well, and whether or not violence is ever acceptable or even necessary. As previously mentioned, Susie spends a good portion of the game as an uncontrollable, violent monster, and indeed she's even introduced as an antisocial bully who threatens to literally kill Chris. He also refuses to work alongside Chris and Ralphie at first altogether, despite Ralphie pointing out that she is technically the hero of prophecy who is supposed to save the world. She only joins the party because it becomes clear that the Dark World is full of puzzles that Chris is best suited to solving, as well as obstacles that explicitly require multiple individuals to overcome. Even then, she's extremely against the idea of sparing enemies, viewing them all as obstacles who, at best, should be taken down in self-defense and, at worst, are basically target practice for her. Like, she's not supposed to be a great person. Meanwhile, the character Lancer hounds the three of you basically from the very start of the game, acting as a self-proclaimed bad guy and just really trying his best. At one point, after a particularly non-threatening encounter with him, Susie begins to intimidate him, threatening him in much the same way she did Chris earlier. However, instead of being scared, Lancer is instead impressed and seriously congratulates Susie for how good a bad guy she is. This actually really impacts Susie, catching her off guard and literally leaving her with some mixed emotions, with her being some heavily... This actually really impacts Susie, catching her off guard and clearly leaving her with some mixed emotion, with there being some heavy implication that this is the first time she's actually gotten positive reinforcement from anyone. It's such a shift that a little while later, after a battle where Susie is, at best, unhelpful and at worst actively detrimental, since the enemy involved can't be beaten through combat and actually becomes more threatening whenever it takes enough damage, when Ralsei finally snaps and points out that Susie is just making life harder for all of them and tries to get her to be a better hero, she actually turns against Chris and Ralsei, instead choosing to join Lancer as one of the bad guys. Ironically, during this period, she's actually less malicious towards the remaining heroes, instead spending most of the sequence just goofing off and having fun with Lancer, doing dumb stuff like making a bad bake sale stand, getting Lancer's subjects to fan them, and even making the heroes design a robot intended to beat them up. They then blow up the robot after building it, because of course they do. Honestly, the impression you get isn't that they're evil villains or bad guys or even really particularly violent. Lancer just kind of comes across as a kid, and Susie just feels like, well, a teenager. You get the feeling these are two people who have maybe had like half a good parental figure each, and neither of whom actually had any sort of legal custody. They just happened to be in the general areas the kids were growing up. This turns sour once the pair join Chris and Ralsei after defeat, and they approach the main goal of the journey, the Dark Fountain in the Card Castle ruled by Lancer's father, the king. Lancer panics, knowing the heroes need to seal the Dark Fountain in order to fulfill the prophecy and for Chris and Susie to return home, but also knowing that will bring them in direct opposition to his father. So he has his minions lock the trio up in the castle dungeon, something Susie realizes after breaking out of her cell. I've got to say, this scene is intense. It's this conflict between arguably two best friends, and it shows Susie at her absolute lowest. And there are moments where you think she might genuinely kill Lancer, and then he starts doing the same move Toriel does in Undertale, and his attacks start missing you on purpose. And this is Barney the dinosaur fighting a freaking playing card. Why am I getting choked up? Alright, the Zoloft withdrawal. Anyways, Lancer admits that he knows that with the way things are going, it's all going to lead to a big fight between the heroes and his father, and he knows there's a good chance one or both sides are going to end up dead as a result. And he really doesn't want that. Susie assures him that they can try to just talk things out, but Lancer responds that he doesn't think his dad will like that. And I'm going to be perfectly honest, I get hard abuse vibes from Lancer and his dad. I'm generally not in favor of diagnosing fictional characters as having abusive relationships. I think it can often end up being really harmful to try to map real-world abuse onto characters in fantastical situations. But like, as someone who has, let's just say, first, second, and third-hand experience with abusive parents of some kind, I'd be a little surprised if that wasn't at least a subconscious influence for the characters. So at this point, Susie assures him that she and the other heroes will do their best to solve things peacefully with the king. And after she frees Chris and Ralsei, she confides in a former that she really does want to give this more peaceful way of doing things a try. She even agrees to obey any command Chris gives in battle, even if she doesn't necessarily like it. Now, I've seen people say this is where she finally turns around and starts being friends with Chris and Ralsei, and while I can definitely see the argument there, I don't think that's quite what's going on here. Really, a consistent part of Susie's character in Deltarune is she's less interested in being good or bad, and more just kind of a teenager who really wants to be loved. She doesn't agree to work with Chris because she suddenly sees the value in their way of doing things. She agrees to work with Chris because it's the only way she can think of to help Lancer. She clearly doesn't hate Chris as much after this point, but, well, okay, let's go to the final boss, at least of Chapter 1. The fight with the king is not very friendly. It starts with Lancer approaching the king, who grabs him, yells at him, and then threatens to drop him off the side of a building if the heroes don't kneel to him. Again, it's clearly a very fantastical situation all around, but, well, you know. In any case, Lancer rebels against his father, attacking him with his own spades. After this, the fight proper begins, and, well, you can't really spare him. Each character has the option to talk to him, but he never listens, simply insisting he's in the right. You basically have to fight him violently, which actually forms an odd parallel between him and Asgore. I mean, being real, most of Chapter 1 feels like a very slightly truncated version of Undertale's general plot. A human falls down into another world, meets various creatures, including a fuzzy goat who wants to protect them, a white-themed antagonist who's really not threatening at all and ends up becoming the human's friend, and a very butch monster lady who's implied to have scales, and who's introduced terrifyingly and seemingly wanting to kill the human, with the journey ultimately taking them to the castle of the local king and having to fight him regardless of any previous pacifism. Also, one of the main characters is a morally ambiguous creature who insists on violence throughout and establishes as basically the only member of the local society who actually intends to hurt people, which could only be more on the nose if she had flower petals glowing off her face. Considering this is only Chapter 1, I think the idea was to draw fans in and introduce new concepts in a familiar setup and structure, plus get the obvious let's just do Undertale but again impulse out before moving on to slightly more original territory. It's like The Force Awakens doing most of the original trilogy again. Except hopefully Chapter 3 isn't just going to be Hotland and the core all over again, with Asgore somehow being literally the villain again, and not like a villain who's reminiscent of Asgore or has parallels, but the literal Asgore, because, you know what, saying all this out loud, there might actually be a chance this happens because Chapter 2 does end with a dark world forming around the TV set, which is given emphasis, so it's possible the story will return to the TV show conceit of the Metacon sections in Undertale. Plus, from the 2 chapters we've seen, the main antagonists do have very strong parallels in their relationships with the monster leads, like Lancer's situation very clearly mirroring Susie's own social situation and the implications that she is a victim of, if not abuse, definitely neglect. Plus, the parallels between Queen and Noelle's mother are so blatantly obvious that it seems almost guaranteed to have been an intentional part of the character, and with Sorio being right there as the Dark Fountain opens and the general idea that she might fill the role Noelle did in Chapter 2 come the 3rd chapter, it would make sense for the main villain to very strongly resemble Asgore. But again, is that the same as the villain literally being Asgore, or is it something really different? Why does my brain do this? Anyways, the sequence with the king, or maybe just king, or if you want to go potentially accurate to the themes but less accurate to in-game. Anyways, the sequence with the king, or maybe just king, or if you want to go potentially accurate to the themes but less accurate to actual in-game dialogue, the Spade King or the King of Spades is interesting. Basically, King is framed as more or less irredeemable. He does seem to have motives for what he's doing, and there is a moment where he seems to indicate a willingness to surrender and talk things out, and then, yeah, no, he tries to kill the whole party. Chris actually stands up to try and protect Susie, which I should note they do entirely without player input. Like, we'll get into it later, maybe, probably, but it's very important to delineate what the player essentially makes Chris do, and what Chris does entirely of their own volition. Also, I would more point to this as the moment where Susie is 100% friends with Chris, since, like I mentioned, she's a teenager who, at least subconsciously, is really in need of approval, and there is a definite theme of her being extremely affectionate, or at least more positive, towards those who show her even a modicum of kindness and warmth. As a result, as King approaches Chris and echoes a line Susie said at the beginning of the chapter, Susie actually attacks him from behind and warns him not to hurt her friend. Then, after this, depending on how the player's gone through the game, either the darkness of the Card Kingdom rebel against the king and overthrow him in favor of Lancer, or Rousey puts the king to sleep, nullifying his threat long enough for Chris and Susie to reach the Dark Fountain. Keep in mind, neither of those necessarily involves sparing King. That's actually kind of a big deal, since in Undertale there wasn't actually a single monster who couldn't be in some way on some route redeemed or spared. Even Asgore and Sans, 2 fights where sparing is very firmly established as not an option, both become the player's allies in a pacifist run. Here though, nope. Some have actually pointed out that King's Gambit, being a brutal, violent bully who attacks everyone, and when they seem to be sparing him, actively disables and almost kills them, is actually a pretty apt comparison to the player's behavior in Undertale's more openly aggressive moments. In this lens, the fight is less comparable to the Asgore battle than, say, the Sans fight at the end of a No Mercy run, a fight that fans had already discussed maybe intended less as the player fighting one last monster and more as a role reversal, with Sans temporarily taking the role of the hero and Megalovania possibly even acting less as Sans' boss theme and more of the players. Even disregarding that theory, it sure seems like both these moments are saying, hey, some people will refuse any attempt at peaceful resolution, and if it means protecting people, sometimes violent backlash. Even disregarding that theory, it sure seems like both these moments are saying, hey, some people will refuse any attempt at peaceful resolution, and if it means protecting people, sometimes violent backlash towards those people is justified and right. It's a very nuanced message, and it's one that's kind of absent from Undertale's pacifist playthrough. Overall, I really do think the story is an improvement on Undertale's. Shorter, to be sure, but that makes sense, since it's chapter 1 of 7, and it was put out as essentially a free demo. And that's not even mentioning parts of the game that are just a straight, unarguable improvement, like the graphics, which look gorgeous. Debbie Chang returned as lead artist and animator, and as good as I think her art for Undertale was, she's really shown her stuff with Deltarune. Not that she's the only one to thank for the art, of course. Toby did a lot of design for the game, and pretty much all of the playing card. Not that she's the only one to thank for the art, of course. Toby did a lot of design for the game, and pretty much all of the playing card themed characters are based on designs by artist Hinotines. Plus the few characters from Undertale who made it over that got designs from Magnolia Porter. And the music, oh my god. Toby always goes hard on the music, but my god, this game does it so well. I don't know if it's clear, but I love Deltarune, even if it isn't 100% complete yet. I've loved it since I first played it on Halloween 2018. And from what I can tell, most of the fandom also loves it. Of course, then the epilogue included Sans, and the internet lost its mind. Jesus. So, yeah, while a lot of people engage with Deltarune as its own separate entity and analyze the story independently, let's be real here. A lot of people just straight up couldn't, and that's pretty damn understandable. If all the bizarre buildup on Twitter and in the Switchport wasn't enough, there were a few key parts of the game that were a bit off. The primary location of Chapter 1's intro and epilogue is Hometown, a small town mostly inhabited by monsters, except for the sole human, Cress, the teenage sibling of the now-in-college Asriel, which in the Undertale timeline would place it absolutely nowhere. Not only that, but 90% of the inhabitants of Hometown are monsters you can meet in Undertale, but pretty much all of them have at least one major difference. Most notably, Undyne. Undyne can be seen in the intro and epilogue without eye patch. Alphys is a nervous, unassertive teacher with reversed anime opinions from Undertale, and Snowdrake is a dick. You can even find a graveyard in the epilogue with most of the characters who in Undertale compose the amalgamates, as well as one of the shopkeepers, Gurs, though admittedly in his case he was a very, very old turtle. So, okay, a lot of the same characters, but in very different situations, sometimes with slight personality changes. No big deal. What did we spend so much time talking about with Sans? So, the world of Deltarune is an alternate universe, possibly both in the multiverse sense and the fandom sense. Not the biggest deal doing the story in a different version of the same world, but with a few recurring characters. Hell, the Zelda series has been doing that for what, over 30 years now? Well, there's a bit more to it than that. First, as I mentioned, about 90% of the town is recurring, but the other 10% isn't necessarily just made up from thin air. I mean, some kind of are, like Jockington, and there wasn't much indication that Caddy had a goth teenage sister, but, well, we've already alluded to the weird situation with Susie. By all accounts, she doesn't, in any way, shape, or form, exist within the world of Undertale, and yet she is referenced by a secret character in the game, and seems to be an important piece of the puzzle, despite essentially just being a particularly strong teenage girl who's supposed to save a completely different world. It's not just her, though. One family that's introduced in this game are the Holidays, a family of reindeer who have been longtime friends of the Journeyers. One family that's introduced in this game are the Holidays, a family of reindeer who have been longtime friends of the Dreamers. Now, again, this could just be assumed to be another aspect of the universe that is completely different, but the thing is, it wasn't, at all. See, during Undertale's second anniversary, Toby teased an alarm clock application based on Undertale, which had brand new dialogue for the characters. This plan never did come to fruition, presumably because he chose to focus on, the actual full game he was working on, but he did include some samples of the dialogue in the announcement post. And in one of those samples, one character, implied to be Asgore, discusses his relationship with someone named Rudy, who he refers to as his Rudolph, and that this Rudy had a wife and daughter. He notably refers to Rudy exclusively in past tense, by the way. In case it wasn't clear, Rudolph Holiday exists in Deltarune, and is, for lack of better words, the patriarch of the Holiday family, which at the very least includes his wife and one daughter. Now, this connection could have been ignored, since the alarm clock was never released and this dialogue was already speculated to have been included as a joke. But for Undertale's 5th anniversary, about 2 years after Deltarune came out, Toby released a lot of the dialogue from the failed alarm app to the official website, specifically the winter/Christmas related dialogue. That dialogue about Rudy was included, though it was changed a fair amount from the original. However, if anything, it was expanded, with reference being made to Rudy having multiple daughters, the confirmation that Asgore and Rudy met in university, and my god, these bitches were gay. And good for them, but it is blatant. In any case, this all seemed to point to the Rudy from these alarm clock messages being the same Rudy as in Deltarune. Now, in Deltarune, Rudy is sick and in a hospital. However, in the alarm clock, Asgore makes reference to Rudy having fallen down, which based on Undertale is closer to going comatose, and then passing away before the monsters could make it to the surface. What does this all mean? I don't know. I genuinely have no idea. The fact that some characters are dead when in Undertale they were alive, but others are alive when they should be dead, it feels like it means something. It feels like it's important, but I have no idea. Even if we assume that the whole thing is just an alternate universe, and some characters are changed more drastically between them, well, we come back to Sans. Now, it's worth noting that while multiple characters appear in both Undertale and Deltarune, most of them are changed in one way or another, not just in personality, but in appearance and sprite. This can range from major changes to the body, like Undyne's suddenly reappeared eye, to just simple clothing changes, like Alphys's outfit. Sans is literally the exact same. He's wearing the same clothes, his talk sprite is identical, hell, even his house and his store, just his original house from Snowdin, snow included, and the restaurant nearby, Groby's, with Sans' name written on it. He's also more or less identical in personality, or at least the surface personality the player deals with when first meeting Sans in Undertale. The really weird thing, though, is the dialogue. The player has the option to have Chris greet Sans like a known friend, which he notes is weird considering they've never met before. In fact, pretty much all the dialogue you can have with Sans, your options are based around things from Undertale, that if they do apply to this version of Sans, Chris should not know about. In the meantime, he does occasionally prank Chris, including if they say they think he and their mom, Toriel, should be friends, his response is, and I quote, "I already befriended your mom last night." He makes it clear immediately that he was speaking literally, that he had met. It makes it clear immediately that he was speaking literally, that he had met and talked to her, and that's pretty much it. But, like I said, some people did already ship them in Undertale, and that wording is 100% intentional. Naturally, this led to a lot of memes within the fandom, largely based around the absurdity of the sentence, Sans Undertale fucked my mom. He also makes reference to his younger brother, pretty much universally agreed to be papyrus, and says he wants you to meet his brother tomorrow, though that's not quite how things played out. In any case, there is a lot going on. And keep in mind, this isn't the only place with weird stuff. It's the most memorable for most fans, since, you know, what is this video ostensibly about? But there are plenty of oddities in the hometown sequence. For example, having Chris talk to Undyne gives the player the chance to suggest she and Alphys meet, a reference to Undertale where they end the game in a relationship, but here they've seemingly never met. Going to the hospital to meet Mr. Holiday will have him note some of the strange stuff Chris can do as a... I'm bad. Going to the hospital to meet Mr. Holiday will have him note some of the strange stuff Chris might do in his room, like interacting with random things, not to mention Chris being unable to play the piano in the hospital's waiting room, despite very much being able to play the piano. And of course there's the bird-like NPC in the local library, who just talks about liking the books upstairs, which wouldn't be particularly noticeable if it weren't for them having a dead ringer of a silhouette for the old head growing out of the ground Gaster follower. All of this is weird. Okay, Sans being here and seemingly being at least somewhat aware of something being up isn't the only weird thing. It's a big thing, and it's worth noting, but it's not the only thing worth noting. Like the ending. Like, what the fuck? So there is a weird thing about the player in this game. So before the intro to the game proper, you go through like a character creation setup. You're shown the soul, the way you'll be interacting with the world, and then asked to create a vessel for the soul, including both its appearance and its personality. But then after you name it, and yourself, the game throws the vessel away, and you control Chris for the whole game. Well, sort of. There are points in the game, notably kneeling to protect Lancer and standing to protect Susie, where Chris takes action outside of the player's control. Additionally, a lot of the epilogue implies Chris is acting deeply out of character to certain people in Hometown who know them better, even ignoring the piano incident. However, the thing is, the player isn't just controlling Chris. In battle, the soul getting hit can deal damage to any of the members in the party, and it's probably worth noting that while commanding Susie and Ralphie to act requires Chris to take an action, the player can have them cast spells, attack, spare, and use items, all while Chris is doing something else, or, if a fight's going badly, on the ground with negative HP. Hell, during the sequence where the gang is imprisoned, as alluded to earlier, Susie has a fight with Lancer completely independent of Chris, and yet the soul still appears and can get her hurt if it's hit. Even before that fight, there's a moment where she's exploring outside her cell and the player can choose something to say to her, which she seemingly hears despite now being really fucking far from Chris at this point. Even in the ending, while a lot of people theorized that Chris was being possessed by Kara, or was somehow being controlled, which is still a possibility, others noted that the player can still move the soul around in that birdcage, and Chris would have every reason to be pissed off if, say, an extra-dimensional entity had taken control of their body for a day, made them act strange and irrationally around the people they know, and put them in life-or-death situations that, depending on the interpretation, they either always managed to survive somehow, or led to them feeling death multiple times. Remember how I mentioned a delineation of the player and the characters they control in Undertale? Here, that's not a plot twist or secret point. That seems like it's shaping up to be the main theme of the game. And look, this is not all there is to talk about with Deltarune Chapter 1. We can talk about Jevil and his apparent relation to various important figures in Deltarune and his implied connection to Gaster. We could talk about how the intro, seemingly narrated by Gaster, is seemingly hijacked by another entity who happens to talk a lot like No Mercy Kara. We could talk about Ralsei, how his name is a meaningful anagram of Asriel, and when he removes his hat at the end of the game, he looks a hell of a lot like a boss monster. We could talk about Chris themselves, how they seemingly combine aspects, both visual and in personality, from both Kara and Frisk while still being their own entity, or how the player literally steals their save file at the first save point. We could talk about blood, and how some lines seem to confirm that, like in Undertale, only humans have blood, while other lines suggest that Darkners and possibly even some Lightner monsters have blood, which has big implication considering that at the end of the Sans fight in the original Undertale, he very conspicuously bleeds. We could even talk about the theory that the Sans we meet in Undertale is in fact from the Deltarune universe, possibly even the Dark World, since he has blood, as just mentioned. Darkners had colored top purchase which wouldn't be noticeable with the pure white skeleton, and if you talk to the Clam Girl, his workshop contains a drawing of 3 people with the words "Don't Forget" written on it, with "Don't Forget" being the end credits song of Deltarune, and all of that should be talked about, but oh my god, there's just so much! Makes you sick. Wow. I'm gonna take a restroom break, and then I'll be back to finish off the script. Ah. Okay. Not long after chapter 1... Not long after Chapter 1's release, Toby Fox began speaking about the game, discussing its influence and notably his inspiration for the game. So, back in 2012, an online artist with the username Kinotines made a set of playing cards for his school project, with some very interesting designs. Toby Fox, on his Tumblr account, which he still has by the way, reblogged and said, quote, "I'd play with these," all the way back in April 2012. According to Fox, this was the original inspiration behind making an RPG. He wanted to make a video game based on the characters seen on these playing cards, particularly the face cards. He even revealed concept art for Deltarune from before the Undertale Kickstarter even began, meaning Deltarune wasn't just known about during the development of Undertale. Toby knew several major characters and themes for the game before he even knew if he could make Undertale. This is absurd, and I love it. Now, he also stated that there were no plans for an episodic release of Deltarune. While he would be taking longer to make the final game, especially since he had seemingly contracted a permanent wrist injury while making Undertale, and thus he might need a team, the plan was not to release each chapter individually over the years it would take to make them. Chapter 1 was essentially the demo, and the rest of the chapters, or at least most of them, would be released all at once when they were complete. However, things don't always go according to plan, and by 2020, things were apparently kind of rocky. Toby had mapped out an outline of basically the whole game, had ideas and plans for more or less every major event, plot beat, battle, and character, but development had stalled, as they had spent a long time looking for possible alternatives to the Game Maker engine and ultimately had to return to that engine. Additionally, while the chapters were intended to be separate mostly in the same way, say, Snowden and Waterfall are separate in Undertale, each one was a major undertaking, along the lines of a full game of content, and it was easier for Toby and his small team to just work in order. The end result was that while Chapter 2 was about 80% complete, the rest of the game was still a long way away from even having finished concrete design, let alone being programmed, tested, reprogrammed, and packaged together. And keep in mind, this update came almost 2 years after Chapter 1's release, and in right about the beginning of the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. Around the time when most people were still aware the problem was ongoing, but certain politicians were starting to encourage mass recklessness for the sake of corporate profit. Not a great time to be alive in general. He hoped to use Chapter 2 as a base for future chapters to be developed faster, but it would still take a long time to make those chapters. So, for Undertale's 6th anniversary, he and some folks from Fangamer streamed an edited version of Chapter 1. Then at the end, Toby revealed the opening of Chapter 2, and that it would be released in 2 days. This was a big deal, and when the chapter came out, the fandom almost erupted. It was just as meaty as Chapter 2, if not more so. There were improvements made to the UI, gameplay, and art. The music was, to put it mildly, a jam, and the story was as on point as ever. I could make an entire separate video essay just talking about the insanity of Chapter 2, how it expands on ideas and characters from Chapter 1, how it solves various mysteries but raises 2 more for each one, how the line between player and player character is explored and dissected, how the No Mercy route makes a return from Undertale only more brutal, more cruel, and more disturbing, all while disincentivizing players even better than Undertale did. How the in-game story is shaping up to be just as, if not more interesting than all the theorizing and meta-narrative the game has been using, and how the fandom is finally, as a whole, engaging with Deltarune not as a piece of the Undertale puzzle or the next step on the ladder, but as its own unique work with, yes, an interesting and complex connection to Undertale, but also so much that makes it stand out as an independent game. And you know what? At some point, I may genuinely make that video essay. Hell, one of my first videos on here that got more than a few views in a month was a video largely based on Deltarune Chapter 2. And I fucking love the game, especially as a free extension to the already existing Deltarune demo. But there's something else I want to talk about here. Something that sort of towers over discussion of Deltarune now. Something major that happened in Chapter 2. Something big. Spamton is introduced about halfway through Chapter 2, and if it wasn't clear, he is a lot. Clearly somewhat inspired by spam bots online, he actually has a much bigger role in the game than initially appears. See, at first he's just a random mini-boss that Chris fights while trying to clear up traffic. However, if Chris tries to go pacifist, they end up striking a deal with him, with the details of this deal being vague. Eventually, if the player makes it back to the start of the city area, the dump the party falls into after a roller coaster accident, they can explore backwards and find Spamton's shop. And if they make a deal with him, he gives Chris instructions. And if they've made a deal with him, he gives Chris instructions regarding a basement in Queen's mansion. Queen being the main antagonist of Chapter 2, she's a lot of fun. Players were sort of expecting the whole quest Spamton put them on. In Chapter 1, an optional boss fight could be found if the player goes into a basement in the king's castle and then completes a series of puzzles to grab pieces of the key. Many figured this was what was happening with Spamton and his deal, and sure enough, the endpoint of this quest is an extra difficult boss fight. Specifically, the fight is against a new version of Spamton fused with a strange machine found in the basement to create Spamton Neo. Once Neo awakens, he tries to forcibly take Chris's soul, notable since up to this point the power of human or even Lightner souls hasn't really been discussed. It's also worth noting that up to this point, Chris has been following Spamton's instructions more or less independently, and actively leaving Susie and Ralsei out of the situation for nebulous reasons. The fight is difficult, though not as difficult as Jevel, the bonus boss from Chapter 1, and definitely not as difficult as, say, the Sans boss fight. This is partially because the method of sparing Spamton is a lot easier, at least to process, since it involves cutting the strings or wires or whatever these things are in order to free him, which is pretty quantifiable. It's also partially because of the previously mentioned No Mercy route, or more accurately, Analog, also known as the Weir route or Snowgrave route. In this route, the player, not Chris, but specifically the player, manipulates Noelle into freezing the majority of Darkners in the cyber world to death, as well as Berkeley. I don't know if you can hear the sirens. Oh. Along the way, they are goaded along, instructed, and assisted by Spamton, who more or less fills the role Kara or whoever the more violent narrator of Undertale's No Mercy route was filled. As a result, the final boss of the chapter isn't fought in this route, with Spamton Neo taking over Queen's mansion and stealing the Neo body for himself, and he becomes the final boss of the route, with Chris fighting him solo. There's a lot to be said about this choice, but again, the Snowgrave route feels like it needs its own video essay to properly dissect. In any case, if the player doesn't pull a Snowgrave and they defeat Spamton peacefully by removing his strings, Spamton will believe Chris and their allies are trying to help him gain freedom and let them cut his last string, whereupon he falls to the ground seemingly dead. The team is able to prop him up on a wall and try to talk to him, but he admits he couldn't be free. Go back. The team is able to prop him up on a wall and try to talk to him, but he ultimately admits he couldn't be free and just hopes Chris has more success cutting their own string. He then becomes an ally, allowing the team to leave, though Susie and Chris are notably disturbed, and even Rousey seems to be trying to put up a great front to try to make them feel. He then becomes an ally, allowing the team to leave, though Susie and Chris are notably disturbed, and even Rousey seems to be putting up a brave front to try and make them feel better. By the way, if you notice the parallel between a puppet trying to become free of its strings and not being able to do anything without them, and a player character who desperately wants to not be controlled, even though without a player their world cannot move forward, you're probably right on the money. If the player backtracks again after defeating Spamton, they can learn a fair amount of information. Main takeaway is the seeming funeral a group of minor NPCs in the chapter, the Addisons, hold in his honor at the dump. Or they tell Chris that Spamton was at one point one of them, but he was rocketed into success and stardom by a mysterious benefactor, only to later be abandoned by said benefactor, kicked out of Queen's Mansion, and seemingly went insane. Notably, a lot of the phrasing within these reveals heavily points to Gaster as Spamton's former benefactor, as one line references Spamton's phone call making. Notably, a lot of the phrasing within these reveals heavily points to Gaster. Notably, a lot of the phrasing within these reveals heavily points to Gaster as Spamton's former benefactor, as one line references Spamton's phone making garbage noise, a term used to describe what comes from Chris's phone in the cyber world, which also happens to be the music track that plays in Undertale within the secret room containing Gaster's Entry 17. A room I will remind you is named Gaster's Room. Again, I will point out that while there is a lot to engage with in Deltarune on its own merits, the primary draw on Chapter 1's release was a seeming direct connection to Gaster. Spamton is a very interesting character. Outwardly bizarre, occasionally incomprehensible, and decidedly morally gray, and yet still definitively sympathetic and not necessarily completely malicious, at least not to Chris. Given his design, evocative of certain other characters, but still decidedly unique enough to stand out, has drawn people in. Now, you may have seen a lot of people online talking about Spamton being the next Tumblr sexy man, with people making art that makes him much more attractive than he ever is in-game, and fan reactions being very positive. Personally, while I see the comparison and he fits the archetype, I don't really see that much of this response on Tumblr, and trust me, I know Deltarune Tumblr. To me, he's more of a Twitter or AO3 sexy man, which makes sense considering Tumblr's actually kind of undead these days. It's definitely not at the height of its popularity anymore, but it's also a bit more chill. Granted, you still have not great people there, but it's not as active as, say, the cesspool of Twitter that has done more damage to society and rational thought than, say, the invention of the atomic bomb. The trend is also a lot more toned down than the Sans phenomenon, though there is still dalliances with alternative versions, since Spamton has canonically had at least 2 forms in-game, and is implied to have changed a number of times leading up to the game. There's also been shipping, primarily with Chris, which is still kind of disturbing since they are in high school and very much stated to be a teenager, but after a certain point dealing with fandom, you have to lower your standards of what constitutes acceptable, and at the very least they aren't full-on children, and you could theorize that they're maybe like 18, which isn't much better, but I'm not about to get into a lengthy discussion on the merits and demerits of strict cutoff-based age of consent in a video mainly marketed around the haha funny bone man. Like with Sans, the fascination with Spamton is ultimately a self-sustaining loop with the Undertale and Deltarune fandom as a whole. This is because Spamton is ultimately an important, intriguing character with a significant enough role to be a fan favorite. It's not a coincidence that he became so popular. It's the result of all these factors wrapped into one package. That doesn't mean Toby wasn't happily surprised, of course. This tweet was posted November 26, 2021, only about 2 months after Chapter 2 was released. Apparently during testing, various players weren't exactly into Spamton, and Toby was apparently concerned that he would end up being the only one who actually liked Spamton. That might seem odd, considering Toby has always displayed a very keen awareness of fandom, fan bases, and what players will like or find engaging, but it's worth keeping in mind, Toby Fox is, like, just a dude. He's a 30-year-old who began working on the project that would define probably the rest of his life at 20, and develops one of the most acclaimed video games of the last decade, mainly from the basement of his friend and renowned bad decision maker, Andrew Hussey. No matter how good he is at this, there's always going to be doubt. Like, okay, I know the question you're all thinking is, what the fuck is this video? Why did I make a full video essay about a sect of fandom I wasn't a part of? Why spend so much of that video essay just talking around the main subject? And why focus so much on Undertale and Deltarune at all? And, well, there are a few reasons. The first is that this is just kind of the nature of the format, largely stolen from RedTube and users like Sarah Z and HBomberGuy and even Folding Ideas. The video topic isn't necessarily the majority of the video discussion, as it is an aspect of the subject that's likely to get the most attention on YouTube, and that the topic is used to talk about subjects that are loosely related, or in some cases completely unrelated, that the video essayist finds more interesting to talk about. And there are obviously flaws in this model, especially the broad topic being covered includes some extremely messed up stuff. Like at one point I considered just having the mention of the underage stuff be like a sentence acknowledging it and then not speaking of it again until this section, as sort of a point about how often outwardly disturbing aspects of a topic will be brushed over or barely referenced in favor of whatever the essayist actually wants to talk about. Like I love Sarah Z's video on SDL and the series finale of Sherlock. Like, I love Sarah Z's video on Dustiel and the series finale of Supernatural, but the fact she breezed right by the fact that a big portion of the fandom at one point actively shipped and wrote fics about the real-life actors was definitely unsettling, and like, I'd be lying if I acted like her videos weren't a major inspiration for this one, so it felt weird to just take the format like I'm trying to emulate her without both acknowledging that I'm doing that and acknowledging that while she is overall a good video creator and seemingly a very good person, there are parts of the style that can feel incredibly wrong. So that's the first reason I did this. The second is just that I love Undertale and Deltarune, and I felt like talking about it through a lens that a lot of people know about. The phenomenon of Sans' dedicated fan base is maybe overstated, but definitely interesting, especially as it does come from a very real character with a very complex origin and connection to its source material. And third, I don't know, I just find it kind of inspiring. Like, the Onceler fandom was this big community, a moment in time dedicated to a single character. But that was made by Illuminations, as more or less a cynical cash grab trying to present itself as being an eco-friendly kids movie, with seemingly every part designed by committee to try and appeal to people on a very surface level. But then you have Undertale, this deep and profound and insightful story that manages to be both genuinely funny and genuinely touching, all made by one guy and a couple of his friends, and one of the main characters is just as popular and beloved as the Onceler, but with people also loving the rest of the game around him, and like, how can that not affect you? It's like, so much of Undertale's success feels so surreal, and it is amazing to know that Toby is right there, seeing it firsthand. Toby Fox made a song for an Earthbound ROM hack, and that song is now in the biggest video game crossover ever made. Toby Fox spent possibly years creating a mystery only the most die-hard fans were intended to even start solving, and a key part of that mystery is now in an official Nintendo game. Toby Fox grew up like so many of us in the era of Nintendo and PlayStation and Xbox, and now his game is considered big enough to get a spotlight from all these major publishers. And even a character he was scared would flop hard even among his own fans has become beloved and analyzed and seen as something special, something amazing. And it's not like this was some accident or all down to luck. Yeah, luck was a part of it. Luck is a part of any success. But the fact is, Toby Fox worked fucking hard to do this. I mentioned it before, but in 2016, Toby first made reference to experiencing occasional pain in his wrist when performing certain tasks. In his 2020 development update, he explained that he had been suffering from this pain for a long time, with some speculating that he actually developed it through working on Undertale, and in particular his habit of playing a certain song on the piano over and over again. This reached a breaking point in mid-2020, where he said his wrist was the worst it's ever been, making him unable to play piano or use a mouse and barely able to use a keyboard. He noted that he saw this as something of a bottleneck, and even after physical therapy helped him improve his stamina and made work easier, he still wishes he could do more. He said, and I quote, Now I can use the mouse and keyboard for a certain amount each day, provided I take frequent breaks. I wish I could work without stopping." Toby, if you're watching this video, first off, that's ridiculous, and I hope you've enjoyed it. But there's something else I want to say. What you've done already is amazing. I know that you almost certainly have a lot of pressure on you, both from yourself and other people, to just keep working to try and get things done quick and done well. But believe me, I understand the need to keep working on something even when it's actively, physically hurting you. And I'm not going to try and say, oh, you need to take better care of yourself, because, like, you're a grown man. You're, like, 8 years older than me. You can take care of yourself just fine. Just know that people really do want the best for you. And if that means you need to take time to heal or get better, they'll all still be waiting for you and cheering you on. Besides, the more time before the final release, the more fans have to speculate, and the more that drop is going to hit like a bomb, you know? Here's the bottom line. Sans and Undertale and Deltarune and Spamton didn't come out of a vacuum. These games are genuine works of art. And while I can understand some people not going far if they aren't big on the gameplay, I would still implore anyone with even a passing interest to give it a shot. If you were turned off by a couple of rough edges in Undertale, like some of the art not being perfect or the slow walk speed, go ahead and give Deltarune a shot. You're probably not going to get any more spoiled than this video already did. And the people who like Sans and Spamton aren't just crazy weirdos obsessing over random characters. They are genuine fans, engaging with a layer of the text in unexpected ways, and that shouldn't be demonized. I'd argue it should be celebrated. Except the underage shit, that's still fucking gross.
Bye.